I am Augustus Wright, 69 years old, and the man my son-in-law thought he could throw away like trash. They treated me like I did not matter, belittling me for how they treated my daughter. While they carried on with their lives, I stayed behind, biding my time. But as they celebrated their success, I made sure to leave my mark. When they returned, everything had changed, and I was ready to make them regret every moment they disrespected me and my daughter. They will regret it. I spent my life building a silent empire. But to my son-in-law Brad, I was just a poor old black man from the wrong side of the tracks. Last night at a five-star restaurant, he threw a crumpled $100 bill at my face and told me to get out before his real guests arrived. I just smiled, picked up the bill, and walked away. He thought he won. He had no idea that same hand had secretly funded his entire life. Before I tell you how I tore his world apart piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe arrogance should always come with a heavy price tag. The clinking of crystal glasses and the soft hum of jazz filled the elegant dining room of Le Petit Chateau. We were supposedly there to celebrate Kendra and Brad on their 5th wedding anniversary. I wore my best suit, an older navy two-piece that was clean and perfectly pressed. But in a room full of designer labels, silk dresses, and diamond watches, I stood out. I was a man who worked with his hands, and my son-in-law Brad made sure I knew I did not belong. Brad leaned back in his expensive leather chair, swirling a glass of imported wine. He looked at me with a smirk that made my blood run cold. His friends, a group of arrogant tech executives, watched him with eager anticipation. Brad reached into his tailored suit pocket, pulled out a crumpled $100 bill, and tossed it directly across the table. It landed right in the center of my plate, soaking up the sauce from my dinner. The entire table fell dead silent. "Take that, old man," Brad said, his voice loud and clear enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "Go pay for a cab back to your slum. You have had your free meal. Now it is time to leave before you embarrass Kendra any further." The people sitting with us snickered behind their linen napkins. Brad looked at me with pure disdain, judging my dark skin and my worn-out suit. He was completely convinced of his own superiority, completely certain that I was nothing more than a pathetic burden on his glamorous life. I looked down at the grease-stained bill resting on my plate. I did not yell. I did not throw a punch. I just stared at the face of Benjamin Franklin, feeling a cold, calculating calm wash over my entire body. Brad thought $100 was a fortune to me. He truly believed I was just a retired carpenter surviving on a meager Social Security check. What this arrogant boy did not know was that my calloused hands had built a massive fortune. Over the decades, I secured highly lucrative industrial patents and built a secret trust fund that generated millions. I was a stealth millionaire living simply by choice, not by force. And the greatest irony of all was staring me right in the face. 3 years ago, Brad's precious tech startup was weeks away from total bankruptcy. He was drowning in debt and facing ruin. I was the anonymous angel investor who signed a check for $100,000 to save his company from going under. I saved his livelihood because I loved my daughter. I wanted Kendra to have a secure and comfortable life. And how did he repay that silent generosity? By humiliating me in public. I shifted my gaze to Kendra, my beautiful, brilliant daughter. She is a highly skilled veterinarian, a woman who saves lives every day. But sitting next to Brad, she looked incredibly small. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed firmly on her lap. She did not raise her voice. She did not defend her father. Her silence cut deeper than Brad's insult. It showed me just how deeply he had broken her spirit. Brad had systematically manipulated her into believing she owed him everything, draining her confidence until she became a fearful shadow of the fierce girl I raised. He had convinced her that my presence was a liability. Before I could say a single word, Brad snapped his fingers loudly, summoning a waiter who practically ran to our table. "Get this plate out of here," Brad ordered, waving a dismissive hand toward my ruined food. "And bring the check for his drinks. We need this seat cleared immediately." He turned his cold blue eyes back to me, his face a mask of supreme irritation. "Seriously, Gus, you need to go right now. My actual investors are arriving in 20 minutes. These are VIPs, high-class individuals who expect a certain standard. I cannot have them seeing my father-in-law looking like he just stepped out of a homeless shelter. It is terrible for my brand and terrible for my business." I slowly wiped my mouth with a linen napkin. I kept my face entirely devoid of emotion. I looked around the table, making deliberate eye contact with every single person sitting there. I memorized every face, the laughing friends, the indifferent business partners, the enabling wives. I etched their features into my memory, because when the time came, I would remember exactly who sat back and enjoyed my public humiliation. I reached forward, picked up the messy $100 bill from my plate, folded it carefully, and slipped it into my pocket. "Thank you for the dinner, Brad," I said. My voice was steady, completely masking the raging storm inside my chest. "Happy anniversary, Kendra." My daughter barely managed a nod, a single tear slipping down her cheek and falling onto her dress. I pushed my chair back, stood up with the heavy dignity of a king, and walked out of the dining room. I did not look back. I did not need to. I already knew exactly how I was going to dismantle Bradley Sutton's entire existence piece by piece. The night air was sharp and cool as I walked toward the restaurant parking lot. I needed a moment to breathe, to formulate my strategy before calling a cab. I stepped into the deep shadows near the valet stand, waiting in silence. That was when I heard the heavy thud of the restaurant's side door slamming open. Brad had dragged Kendra outside into the alleyway. He had her pinned against the rough brick wall, his hand gripping her wrist so tightly I could see her wincing in pain. "Listen to me very carefully," Brad hissed, his voice dripping with pure venom. "You are going to fix this mess. You are going to drive to his rundown house tomorrow and make him sign over that rural land. My company needs that asset for collateral right now." "But Brad," Kendra sobbed, her voice trembling with sheer terror. "That land has been in our family for generations. My father will never sell it." Brad yanked her closer, his face inches from hers. "I do not care what you have to do. Cry, beg, manipulate him. Make him feel guilty. If you do not get me that signature by Friday, I am canceling your in vitro fertilization surgery. You will never have a child, Kendra. I will personally make sure of it." I stood frozen in the dark. He was using my daughter's deepest desire to become a mother as a weapon to steal my property. The war had just begun. The very next morning, I drove my old pickup truck to the upscale suburban neighborhood where my daughter lived. I parked at the end of the driveway and walked up to the massive oak front door. I used my spare key to let myself in. The house was immaculately decorated, but it felt completely devoid of warmth. It felt like a museum, not a home. I found Kendra sitting on the cold marble floor of the kitchen. Her knees were pulled up to her chest, and she was sobbing so violently her entire body shook. I dropped my keys and rushed to her side, wrapping my arms around her trembling shoulders. I asked her what was wrong, even though the venomous words I overheard in the alleyway the night before still echoed in my mind. Kendra buried her face in my shoulder and wept. She told me Brad had just left for the office, but not before delivering a brutal morning tirade. He had screamed at her, calling her a useless, broken woman. He blamed her entirely for their inability to conceive a child. He told her she was failing at her one basic duty as a wife. He said he was exhausted from paying for expensive fertility treatments that she was ruining with her own incompetence. My blood boiled. I held my daughter tightly, stroking her hair while suppressing the intense urge to drive straight to his corporate office and break his jaw. He was systematically destroying her self-worth, twisting her mind until she believed she was the sole reason their marriage was straining. I helped Kendra up from the floor and sat her at the kitchen island. I poured her a glass of cold water to calm her down. As I set the glass on the counter, my eyes landed on a clear plastic pill organizer sitting next to the sink. Beside it was a prescription bottle with a bright yellow warning label. I casually picked up the bottle to examine the name of the medication. Brad told her it was a cutting-edge European fertility supplement, but I knew exactly what it was. What Brad did not know was that my massive wealth was not just sitting idle in bank accounts. A decade ago, I invested millions into biotech startups and medical research firms. I currently sit as a silent board member for one of the largest pharmaceutical trusts on the East Coast. I know medical patents inside and out. I recognized the chemical compound listed on that label immediately. It was not a fertility drug. It was a highly controversial hormone blocker, a cheap and dangerous synthetic compound that actively prevents conception. Worse, its side effects included severe emotional instability, severe anxiety, and physical exhaustion. Brad was intentionally feeding my daughter poison to keep her mentally fragile and physically sick. A wave of pure disgust washed over me. While Kendra stepped into the downstairs bathroom to wash her tear-stained face, I noticed something shoved deep into the kitchen trash can. Brad was a deeply arrogant man, and arrogant men are always careless. I reached into the garbage and pulled out a crumpled, heavy piece of medical stationery. I smoothed it out on the counter. It was a certified lab report from a prestigious men's urology clinic in the city. The patient name printed at the top was Bradley Sutton. The procedure listed was a bilateral vasectomy. The date on the document was exactly 2 years ago. The monstrous reality of the situation hit me like a freight train. Brad had intentionally sterilized himself 2 years ago, right around the exact time he and Kendra supposedly started trying for a baby. For 24 months, he had watched his wife inject herself with hormones, swallow dangerous synthetic chemicals, and cry herself to sleep over every negative pregnancy test. He watched her tear her own body apart, completely aware that he was firing blanks. He manufactured her infertility so he could use it as a weapon to control her. He blamed her for a medical reality he created. Kendra walked back into the kitchen, her eyes red and puffy. I shoved the vasectomy report deep into my jacket pocket. I could not hold back anymore. I grabbed her by the shoulders, looked her dead in the eye, and told her to go upstairs and pack a bag. I told her we were leaving this house right now and we were driving straight to the police station. I promised her I was going to have Brad arrested for medical abuse, domestic coercion, and psychological torture. Instead of looking relieved, Kendra completely panicked. The color drained entirely from her face. She pulled away from me, shaking her head frantically. She fell to her knees again, hyperventilating as she crawled toward a hidden drawer built into the base of the kitchen island. Her hands trembled violently as she pulled out a thick, terrifying stack of legal documents tied together with a rubber band. She handed the heavy stack to me, tears streaming down her face once more. I flipped through the pages, my heart sinking with every paragraph I read. It was a commercial business loan agreement for $500,000. The collateral listed on the loan was Kendra's veterinary clinic, the business she had built from the ground up with her own hands. But the worst part was the signature line. The entire massive debt was solely in Kendra's name. Brad had expertly manipulated her into signing as the primary financial guarantor for a massive expansion loan for his tech company. He used her successful debt-free clinic as his personal shield. Kendra choked on her tears as she explained the trap. Brad had threatened her that if she ever left him, or if she ever went to the authorities, he would intentionally default on the loan. The bank would immediately seize her clinic, strip her of her livelihood, and destroy her veterinary license. But Brad had taken it a step further. He deliberately falsified the revenue numbers on the application documents before he forced her to sign them. If the bank investigated the default, Kendra would be the one facing federal charges for bank fraud. She was caught in a flawless financial hostage situation. He held her entire freedom in the palm of his hand, and he used it to keep her obedient. I stood in the kitchen processing the sheer magnitude of this financial crime. I realized my daughter was chained to a literal monster. I opened my mouth to tell her the truth. I was about to tell her that $500,000 was absolute pocket change to me. I was about to tell her I could clear that entire fraudulent debt with a single phone call to my wealth manager. I was about to reveal my secret empire and set her free. Before I could speak a single word, the heavy front door unlocked and swung wide open. The loud clacking of hard leather shoes echoed through the foyer. Brad's white parents marched into the house, dragging expensive designer luggage behind them. They walked into the kitchen and stopped looking at me with pure, unfiltered contempt. They stared at me as if I were a stray dog that had somehow wandered indoors and soiled their pristine floor. Brad's mother scoffed, her lips curling into a cruel sneer. "Oh my," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Augustus is here begging for breakfast money again. How perfectly predictable." Without waiting for a response, she turned her back to me and pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at Kendra. "Listen to me," the older woman commanded, her tone sharp and demanding. "Go upstairs and clear all your cheap clothes out of the master bedroom immediately. We are staying for the entire month and we require the largest room. You can sleep in the guest room down the hall, and I suggest you stay out of our way while we are here. Do not just stand there crying. Get to work." Before Kendra could even process the cruel demands of her mother-in-law, the heavy front door slammed shut again. Brad strolled into the kitchen, his designer leather shoes clicking sharply against the tile. He loosened his silk tie completely, ignoring his wife who was still trembling by the island. He greeted his parents with a warm, arrogant embrace, trading smug smiles with them. Then his cold blue eyes locked onto me. His smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer disgust. He marched right up to me, pulling a folded legal document from his tailored jacket pocket. Without a word of greeting, he threw the heavy stack of paper directly at my chest. The documents hit me and scattered across the marble floor. Brad crossed his arms and looked down at me like I was an insect. He announced proudly that his tech company had just finalized a real estate acquisition early this morning. He told me he bought the entire block of rundown rental properties where my modest house was located. He practically spit the words out, relishing his own perceived power. He stated that his firm was going to bulldoze the entire slum to build a commercial parking lot. He stepped closer, pointing a finger directly at my face. He gave me exactly 3 days to pack up my pathetic life and vacate the premises. He threatened that if I was not gone by Friday morning, he would personally send his private security team to drag me out into the street and throw my cheap furniture into a dumpster. Brad's parents chuckled softly in the background, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of my humiliation. Kendra covered her mouth, a fresh wave of tears streaming down her face as she watched her husband systematically destroy her father. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand tall. I expertly played the role they expected me to play. I let my shoulders slump. I let my hands shake with simulated fear and helplessness. I slowly bent down to the cold floor, gathering the scattered pages of the eviction notice one by one. I held the documents in my hands, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon printed on the crisp white paper. I looked at the parcel numbers. I looked at the name of the holding company Brad had purchased the land from. It took every ounce of willpower in my body not to burst into hysterical laughter right there in his pristine kitchen. Brad was a fool blinded by his own malice. In his desperate, arrogant rush to buy my neighborhood just to have the pleasure of evicting me, he completely bypassed standard corporate due diligence. He bypassed title insurance and rushed a cash transaction. I recognized the name of the seller company instantly. It was a notorious shell corporation run by a known real estate fraudster currently under federal investigation. Brad had just paid millions of his investors' dollars for a completely forged deed. He bought empty air. The greatest irony was that I knew exactly who legally owned that entire city block. It belonged to the Wright Family Heritage Trust. It was a blind trust I established 20 years ago specifically to buy up low-income housing in my community to protect the residents from predatory developers. I was the sole trustee. I owned the land. Brad had literally thrown millions into a black hole just to hand me a fake piece of paper. But I kept my face frozen in a mask of total defeat. I looked at Brad with wide, defeated eyes. I mumbled a quiet, pathetic apology for intruding on his morning. I looked at Kendra, telling her I loved her, and slowly shuffled out the front door, clutching the worthless eviction notice to my chest. I let Brad stand in his kitchen, glowing with the false victory of a man who had just dug his own financial grave. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, the facade dropped completely. I walked down the long, manicured driveway to my beat-up pickup truck. My posture straightened. The trembling in my hands vanished, replaced by a cold, lethal steadiness. I climbed into the cab, started the engine, and immediately dialed a secure number. My lawyer, Richard Kensington, picked up on the second ring. Rick was a ruthless, seasoned corporate shark on Wall Street, a man who charged a fortune because he enjoyed dismantling arrogant executives as much as I did. I gave Rick a rapid, precise summary of the morning. I told him about the fraudulent loan Brad forced Kendra to sign. I told him about the fake real estate transaction Brad just finalized. I instructed Rick to launch a full-scale financial assault immediately. I ordered him to activate Trust Fund Number 4, a massive reserve of liquid capital I kept hidden offshore for aggressive acquisitions. I told Rick to contact every single bank, private lender, and venture capital firm associated with Brad's tech company. I commanded him to buy up every commercial loan, every equipment financing contract, and every bridge loan Brad owed. I did not just want to ruin Brad, I wanted to own him. By purchasing his debt through anonymous shell companies, I would become his absolute primary creditor. The moment his investors realized his real estate acquisition was a multi-million-dollar fraud, his company would instantly violate the covenants of his commercial loans. He would default immediately, and when he defaulted, I would be the one holding the legal right to liquidate his business, seize his assets, and throw him onto the street. Rick let out a low, predatory chuckle on the other end of the line. He confirmed the orders, promising me that by the end of the week, I would hold the puppet strings to Brad's entire existence. I drove back to my modest house, my mind racing with legal strategies and financial traps. I parked in my driveway, walked inside, and locked the door. I barely had time to take off my jacket before my secondary, heavily encrypted phone began to ring. It was Dexter Hayes, my private investigator and a former federal agent who specialized in forensic accounting. Dexter never called this line unless the situation was highly volatile. I answered the phone and his voice came through sharp and tense. Dexter told me to sit down. He had been digging deep into the corporate tax returns of Brad's startup, tracking the movement of the massive loans Brad had been securing. What Dexter found was far more dangerous than simple bank fraud or domestic abuse. Brad was deeply entrenched with a violent illegal sports betting syndicate operating out of the city. He owed them a massive amount of money, but worse, he was actively laundering their dirty cash. Dexter sent a heavy encrypted file to my phone as we spoke. I opened it and felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. Brad was not laundering the money through his own tech company. He was funneling millions in illicit gambling cash straight through Kendra's veterinary clinic. He was generating fake invoices for highly expensive exotic animal surgeries that never actually happened, washing the syndicate's money through her spotless business accounts. Kendra was the sole listed owner of the clinic. She was entirely in the dark, signing off on bookkeeping documents Brad put in front of her. Dexter warned me that federal authorities were already monitoring the syndicate. If the feds raided the clinic tomorrow, Brad would walk away clean, and my innocent daughter would be indicted, arrested, and sent to federal prison for money laundering. I was still processing the horrific reality of the illegal money laundering when Dexter sent another massive encrypted file. This one was not filled with dry tax returns or boring bank ledgers. It was a digital dossier packed with high-resolution surveillance photographs, property records, and deep background checks. I opened the first folder and stared at the glowing screen. Brad was living a complete, elaborate double life. The photographs showed him walking hand in hand with a stunning 28-year-old white woman named Vanessa. She was dressed head to toe in exclusive designer clothing dripping in expensive diamond jewelry. They were laughing, kissing, and loading high-end shopping bags into the back of a luxury European sports car. Dexter's detailed report outlined her background. She was not a successful professional or a peer. She was a high-end opportunist who had been on Brad's secret payroll for over 2 years, acting as a highly compensated mistress. But the most sickening part of the file was not the affair itself. It was where they were conducting it. Dexter had tracked their movements to a sprawling, heavily guarded mansion situated in one of the most exclusive, hyper-wealthy enclaves in the entire state. The photograph showed Brad and Vanessa drinking champagne on a vast marble terrace overlooking a private infinity pool and beautifully manicured gardens. It was a pristine $2 million estate completely hidden behind tall iron gates and purchased through a blind holding company. Brad had created an entire secondary existence, funding a lavish lifestyle for a woman who was doing nothing but draining resources, while my daughter wept on a cold kitchen floor. My mind raced, trying to figure out how a man drowning in business debt and illegal gambling obligations could possibly afford a massive cash purchase for a secret love nest. The devastating answer was waiting for me in the next document of Dexter's file. I opened the property deed attached to the surveillance photos. The mansion was bought entirely in cash exactly 14 months ago. I scanned the financial routing numbers Dexter had brilliantly intercepted, tracing the exact origin of the funds used to close the massive sale. The total wire transfer was for exactly $2,450,000. When I saw that specific number, the air completely left my lungs. My chest tightened as a suffocating wave of absolute blinding fury washed over me. I recognized that exact dollar amount immediately. It matched to the very penny the private inheritance fund my late wife Lorraine had painstakingly built and left exclusively for Kendra. Lorraine had worked tirelessly alongside me during our hardest early years. When she passed away from cancer, she left that money in a locked high-yield savings trust intended to guarantee Kendra's safety and independence, a sacred safety net no one was ever supposed to touch. The money required Kendra's direct in-person signature and notarized approval to be withdrawn. I frantically scrolled down to the bank authorization forms Dexter had managed to pull from the wire transfer history. There at the bottom of the release form was Kendra's signature. But I know my daughter's handwriting. I taught her how to hold a pen. The signature on the screen was a flawless, meticulous forgery. Brad had stolen Lorraine's legacy. He had forged his own wife's signature to empty her dead mother's sacred trust fund, draining the entire account in a single afternoon to buy a mansion for his mistress. He took the ultimate symbol of my late wife's blood, sweat, and love and handed it to an opportunistic parasite. The sheer scale of his malice was almost incomprehensible. He was not just financially abusive. He was a predator, systematically stripping my daughter of every single thing she owned, from her business to her inheritance, all while looking her in the eye every morning and telling her she was a worthless burden. He had robbed my dead wife to finance his infidelity. I gripped the edges of my desk so hard the thick wood groaned under the pressure. The cold, logical calculation of my legal revenge was rapidly being eclipsed by a raw, violent need to tear his life apart. The final file Dexter sent was an audio recording. Dexter explained in his notes that he had managed to clone the Bluetooth system in Brad's luxury car. The audio was captured just 2 nights ago while Brad and Vanessa were driving back to their mansion from a high-end dinner. I clicked play and listened. The crisp, clear sound of smooth jazz played in the background of the car cabin, followed by the clinking of glasses. Then I heard Vanessa's voice. It was high-pitched whining and incredibly greedy. She complained about the mansion demanding a highly expensive renovation for the master bathroom. Brad laughed, a deep, relaxed, genuine sound I had never heard him use around Kendra. He told Vanessa not to worry about the money, promising her she could remodel the entire estate if she wanted to. Vanessa purred in response, asking him how much longer she had to wait before he finally dumped his pathetic wife. I clenched my jaw until my teeth ached as Brad's voice dripped with absolute contempt. He called my brilliant, hard-working daughter a stupid, broken cash machine. He bragged to Vanessa about how easily he manipulated Kendra, boasting that she was so desperate for his approval she would sign anything he put in front of her without even reading it. He laughed maliciously about the fake fertility drugs, joking that Kendra was actively destroying her own body while blindly funding his entire lavish lifestyle. Then Vanessa asked about me. She asked what he was going to do about the annoying father-in-law who kept snooping around. Brad snorted with pure, unfiltered, racist disgust. He called me a dirty, ignorant old black man who was entirely useless to society. He bragged to his mistress that he had just bought my neighborhood and was going to have me thrown out like garbage. He said I was going to starve on the street where I belonged, completely powerless to stop him. Listening to them openly mock my daughter's pain and my supposed poverty was a surreal, enraging experience. They felt so incredibly untouchable in their stolen luxury car, completely oblivious to the fact that the dirty old man they were laughing at was currently buying up every single piece of debt that kept their fragile world intact. But the recording was not over. The final minutes of their conversation chilled me to the bone and completely altered my timeline. Vanessa pressed Brad again on exactly when he was going to officially leave Kendra so they could get married and travel the world. Brad told her to be patient for just 1 more week. He laid out a detailed, monstrous timeline. He explained that his tech startup was scheduled to receive a massive round of venture capital funding next Thursday. Once that money cleared his accounts, he was going to force Kendra to sign over the final remaining shares of her veterinary clinic. And then he revealed his ultimate horrifying exit strategy. He told Vanessa he had already bribed a corrupt psychiatrist to draft a fraudulent medical evaluation. As soon as he secured the clinic shares, he was going to use Kendra's hormone-induced emotional instability as undeniable proof that she was a severe danger to herself. He was planning to have my daughter legally committed to a locked psychiatric ward against her will. He would seize total medical and financial power of attorney, lock her away in an asylum, and file for a highly favorable divorce while she was heavily medicated and institutionalized. He was going to erase her from society entirely. The audio file ended, leaving my home in a suffocating, heavy silence. I could not just sit back and ruin him financially anymore. I had to rescue Kendra right now. The heavy knock on my front door echoed through the quiet house just before noon. I had already reviewed Dexter's horrifying files, but I forced my facial muscles to relax into the weary expression of a defeated old man. I opened the door to find Brad standing on my porch with Kendra tucked nervously behind him. Brad wore a sharp, tailored suit and a predatory smile. He pushed his way into my living room without waiting for an invitation, his expensive shoes tracking dirt across my faded rug. He tossed a glossy, cheaply printed brochure onto my coffee table, followed by a thick stack of legal documents. I looked down at the pamphlet. It was for a state-funded, notoriously understaffed nursing facility on the absolute worst side of the county. It was a facility known for severe health code violations, a grim dumping ground where the elderly were left to wither away under harsh fluorescent lights and heavy sedation. Brad stood tall, crossing his arms with an air of fake benevolence that disgusted me. He announced that since I was being evicted from my neighborhood, he had generously taken it upon himself to secure my future. He pointed to the thick legal packet and demanded I sign it immediately. It was a complete surrender of my medical and financial power of attorney. He claimed he was doing me a massive favor by paying the entry fees out of his own pocket. He looked at me with cold, dead eyes and told me it was time to admit my mind was failing. He stated that I was becoming a severe danger to myself and that he was legally stepping in to take control of my miserable life. I shifted my gaze from the worthless documents to my daughter. Kendra stood near the doorway, her hands nervously twisting the fabric of her expensive coat. She looked physically exhausted. Her usually radiant dark skin looked dull and ashen, and her eyes were deeply sunken. The synthetic hormone blockers Brad was secretly forcing her to swallow were actively ravaging her nervous system, leaving her in a constant state of heightened anxiety, physical weakness, and profound confusion. Brad had spent months meticulously gaslighting her into believing I was suffering from severe aggressive dementia. He had convinced her that my refusal to leave my home was a textbook sign of cognitive decline. Kendra stepped forward, her voice breaking as tears spilled down her cheeks. She begged me to just sign the papers. She told me she was terrified I would end up homeless and wandering the streets of the city. She parroted Brad's poisonous lies, sobbing that my memory was slipping and that Brad was stepping up to save our family from total ruin. Hearing my own daughter echo the manipulation of her abuser tore at my heart. I wanted nothing more than to wrap my arms around her, reveal my hidden wealth, and tell her that we could destroy this arrogant man right here and now. I wanted to pull out the high-resolution photos of his mistress and the forged trust fund wire transfers. But I knew I could not break my cover. I was a grandmaster playing chess against a reckless novice. If I revealed my hand too early, Brad would instantly realize he was cornered. A cornered animal is highly dangerous. If he knew I was onto his crimes, he would rapidly accelerate his plan to lock Kendra in a psychiatric ward before I could legally untangle her from his fraudulent bank loans. I needed Kendra to witness his absolute treachery with her own eyes when the final trap snapped shut. I had to let her believe the painful lie for just a little longer. I swallowed my pride, let my shoulders droop, and allowed a look of total pathetic submission to wash over my face. I nodded slowly, playing the part of the broken father flawlessly. I reached across the table and picked up the heavy black pen Brad had tossed next to the contract. I brought the pen down to the signature line of the power of attorney agreement. The scratch of the metal tip against the thick paper sounded loud in the tense room. I did not just sign the document. I executed a precise, calculated legal maneuver that my corporate lawyer Rick and I had discussed years ago for hostile boardroom takeovers. I forced my hand to tremble violently, mimicking the severe motor skill degradation of an advanced neurological disease. My fingers shook so intensely that the ink sputtered and dragged across the page, but the physical tremor was only part of the deception. I did not sign my actual legal name. I deliberately misspelled my first name and used an entirely fictitious middle initial, creating an alias that had zero legal standing whatsoever. I signed Augustine M. Wright instead of Augustus. In the eyes of a state judge or a bank auditor, the document was fundamentally flawed and entirely void. It was a worthless piece of paper that granted Brad absolutely no authority over my life or my vast hidden assets. Brad was so blinded by his own racism, his arrogance, and his intense eagerness to discard me that he did not even inspect the signature. He just saw the black ink hit the paper and practically lunged forward. He snatched the packet off the coffee table with a triumphant, greedy smirk. He quickly folded the document and shoved it into the inner breast pocket of his designer suit jacket. As he leaned over the table, his jacket brushed directly against my arm. In that split second, utilizing the sleight of hand I had practiced perfectly all morning, I slipped a microscopic audio transmitter right into the deep fold of his front pocket. The tiny magnetic device caught onto the silk lining invisibly. Dexter had provided me with the military-grade listening device just an hour prior. Brad stood back up, adjusting his tie with a look of supreme victory. He looked down at me and whispered that I should pack a very small bag, adding cruelly that they do not allow patients to bring much garbage into the state facility. He grabbed Kendra tightly by the arm, dragging her toward the front door without another word. The heavy front door slammed shut, leaving me alone in the sudden, echoing silence of my living room. I immediately pulled my encrypted phone from my pocket and activated the receiver application connected to the hidden transmitter. I walked over to the window and peered through the blinds. Brad was marching confidently down the driveway, leaving Kendra to trail behind him in the cold air. Before he even reached the driver's side door of his luxury car, he pulled out his cell phone and dialed a number. The audio fed directly into my earpiece, crystal clear and horrifyingly cold. I heard the voice of the corrupt psychiatrist answer on the other end of the line. Brad did not waste a single second with pleasantries. He told the doctor that the old man had been dealt with and would be permanently out of the picture by the weekend. Then his tone shifted into something purely evil. He told the doctor there was a sudden change of plans regarding his wife. He ordered the psychiatrist to move the involuntary psychiatric holdup immediately. He stated that Kendra was becoming far too unstable and that he wanted her legally committed to the locked ward tomorrow morning. "Have the transport order ready," Brad commanded harshly. "I want the medical team waiting at my house at exactly 8 in the morning to take her away." He laughed, assuring the doctor the wire transfer for the massive bribe was already cleared through his accounts. The call disconnected. I stood by the window staring at his car pulling out of my driveway. He thought he had just secured his ultimate victory. He had no idea he had just handed me the exact timeline I needed to completely annihilate him. The crisp autumn wind bit through my thin jacket as I pulled my rusted truck into Brad's sprawling driveway that evening. It was Thanksgiving. Despite his secret arrangements to have my daughter forcibly committed to a psychiatric ward the very next morning, Brad had insisted on hosting a lavish holiday dinner. He wanted to parade his fake wealth in front of his arrogant family and business associates. He demanded I attend strictly so he could relish his final cruel victory over me before I was supposedly shipped off to a state-run nursing facility. I walked through the grand foyer, but I was not directed to the massive mahogany dining table in the formal dining room. Instead, Brad pointed a dismissive finger toward the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. He told me the main table was reserved for his distinguished guests and that I would be much more comfortable eating with the hired help. I walked into the cramped hot kitchen and took a seat on a small metal stool tucked into the corner next to the industrial trash cans. Through the narrow glass window of the swinging doors, I could see the glittering crystal chandeliers, the polished silver, and the mountains of expensive food. I sat in total silence, eating cold turkey and bland potatoes from a flimsy, disposable paper plate, while the hired catering staff rushed around me. I watched my daughter sitting at the far end of the grand table. Her shoulders were slumped and she was barely touching her meal. I chewed my food slowly, swallowing the humiliation completely sustained by the knowledge that this was the absolute last night Bradley Sutton would ever experience peace. The heavy kitchen doors swung open violently and Brad's father marched into the room. He was a tall, imposing white man with a perfectly tailored suit and a face permanently set in a sneer of absolute superiority. He ignored the busy catering staff completely and walked straight toward the large temperature-controlled wine refrigerator to retrieve a specific vintage bottle. As he turned around with the expensive wine in his hand, his cold eyes landed on me sitting in the dim corner. A cruel, mocking smile spread across his face. He walked over and stood towering above me, swirling the expensive red liquid in the bottle. He told me it was entirely fitting that I was eating in the kitchen where I belonged. He leaned in closer, his breath reeking of expensive bourbon and deep-seated hatred. He whispered that the natural order of the world always corrects itself eventually. He told me that people of my skin color and my low social class were genetically designed to serve families like his. He said I should fall on my knees and thank his son for pulling Kendra out of the gutter and giving her a taste of real civilization. He sneered that after tomorrow, when I was finally locked away in a state-funded asylum, they would officially wash the last remaining stain of my heritage from their bloodline. I did not blink. I did not drop my plastic fork. I looked straight into his pale, arrogant eyes and continued to chew my food in absolute terrifying silence. I memorized every single wrinkle on his face, every gray hair on his head, and the exact tone of his racist voice. I locked his image away in my mind because I already knew what my lawyer Rick had discovered just an hour ago. Brad had secretly used the deed to his parents' luxury home as collateral to secure an illegal loan from the violent gambling syndicate. When I triggered the financial collapse next week, this arrogant man standing before me would lose his ancestral home. He would end up sleeping on the very streets he was mocking right now. I swallowed my food, gave him a slow, empty nod, and let him walk back into the dining room feeling like a conqueror. I stood up from my metal stool and moved toward the swinging doors to keep a close eye on my daughter. The formal dining room was filled with loud, boastful laughter as Brad held court at the head of the table. He abruptly snapped his fingers and ordered Kendra to get up and serve the vintage wine his father had just brought out. Kendra stood up obediently like a frightened servant. Her hands were shaking violently. The toxic synthetic hormone blockers Brad had been forcing her to take were actively ravaging her nervous system, causing severe muscle tremors and profound exhaustion. She gripped the heavy crystal decanter with both hands, her knuckles turning bone white as she tried desperately to steady herself. She walked over to Brad to pour his glass. As she tipped the heavy bottle, her weakened wrists finally gave out. The crystal decanter slipped from her grasp and crashed onto the edge of the mahogany table. A massive wave of dark red wine splashed directly onto Brad's tailored suit jacket and soaked deeply into his pristine, custom-made white Persian rug. The entire dining room went dead silent. The soft jazz music playing from the hidden speakers seemed to fade into nothingness. Brad stood up slowly, his face contorting into a terrifying mask of pure, unhinged rage. He did not yell. He did not scold her. He simply raised his right hand and delivered a brutal, ringing slap directly across Kendra's face. The sharp crack of flesh against flesh echoed violently off the high ceilings. The sheer force of the blow sent my daughter crashing to the hardwood floor. She curled into a defensive ball, clutching her rapidly bruising cheek, sobbing quietly in sheer terror. I looked around the table at the guests. Brad's parents did not even flinch. His mother casually took a sip of her sparkling water. His business partners looked down at their porcelain plates, intentionally ignoring the horrific domestic violence that had just occurred right in front of their eyes. They were completely complicit, silently endorsing his brutality by refusing to intervene. That was the absolute final drop. The time for hiding in the shadows was officially over. I pushed the swinging kitchen doors open with such violent force that they slammed incredibly hard against the dining room walls. I marched directly into the center of the room. Every head at the long table snapped toward me in shock. Brad puffed out his chest, stepping right over my weeping daughter, getting ready to scream at me to get out of his house. I did not throw a punch. I did not physically assault him. I was a man of immense power, and kings do not brawl with peasants. I walked right up to him, stopping mere inches from his face. The room was so quiet you could hear the rapid beating of my heart. I looked deep into his terrified blue eyes and let the facade of the weak old man completely shatter into pieces. I told him in a voice as cold and sharp as a scalpel that he had just signed his own financial death warrant. I told him he would spend the rest of his miserable life drowning in an ocean of debt, begging for mercy he would never receive. I reached down, grabbed Kendra firmly by the hand, and pulled her up to her feet. I wrapped my arm tightly around her trembling shoulders, shielding her from the monsters sitting at the table. Without another word, I walked my daughter out the front door and into the cold, dark night, leaving Bradley Sutton standing in a puddle of wine in his own impending doom. I drove my rusted truck away from that house of horrors with Kendra shivering in the passenger seat. She kept looking out the window, fully expecting me to head back to the rundown neighborhood Brad had just tried to evict me from. Instead, I merged onto the highway and drove straight into the glittering heart of the downtown financial district. I pulled up to the secured underground garage of a sleek, ultra-exclusive high-rise building. The armed security guards immediately stood at attention, saluting me respectfully as the heavy steel gates opened automatically. Kendra wiped her tears, her eyes darting around the pristine parking structure in utter confusion. I guided her to a private glass-walled elevator that required a biometric fingerprint scan to operate. We rode in silence to the very top floor. The elevator doors slid open, revealing my true home. It was a sprawling, multi-million-dollar penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire city skyline. Expensive modern art lined the walls, and a massive marble fireplace dominated the main living area. Kendra stopped dead in her tracks. Her jaw dropped. She looked at my faded jacket, then back at the staggering luxury surrounding us. She stammered, asking whose home this was and why we were trespassing. I gently took her coat, hung it in the mahogany closet, and told her the absolute truth. I told her it was my home. I told her I bought the entire top 2 floors of this building 10 years ago. I watched the shock wash over her exhausted face as she realized her supposedly impoverished, helpless father was actually living like a titan of industry. I guided her to the massive glass coffee table in the center of the room and told her to sit down on the plush leather sofa. I walked over to a hidden wall safe, unlocked it, and pulled out the thick, heavy files Dexter had compiled. I brought the stack over and dropped it directly onto the glass table. The heavy thud made Kendra jump. I told her it was time to end the lies. I did not soften the blow. I pulled out the certified vasectomy report and placed it right in front of her. I watched her read the date and the medical summary. I explained that Brad had sterilized himself 2 years ago. Every hormone pill she swallowed, every tear she cried over a negative pregnancy test was part of a cruel manufactured illusion. Then I threw down the high-resolution surveillance photographs. I showed her Vanessa, the 28-year-old mistress, draped in diamonds and laughing on the terrace of a hidden mansion. Kendra stared at the glossy images, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she recognized her husband holding another woman. Before she could look away, I slammed the financial wire transfers onto the table. I pointed to the forged signature. I told her Brad had completely emptied the sacred trust fund her mother Lorraine had left for her. He used her inheritance to buy that mansion for his mistress. Finally, I played the audio recording I captured on the encrypted phone. I forced her to listen to Brad's cold, calculating voice as he detailed his plan to declare her mentally unstable. I forced her to hear him confess to bribing a corrupt psychiatrist so he could lock her inside a psychiatric ward tomorrow morning and steal the last remaining shares of her veterinary clinic. I laid out every single piece of his monstrous puzzle. The sheer volume of the betrayal hit Kendra like a physical blow. She doubled over, clutching her stomach as a wave of violent nausea overtook her. She dry heaved over the edge of the sofa, gasping for air as her entire reality shattered into a million jagged pieces. The man she loved, the man she defended, had systematically poisoned her body, robbed her mother's legacy, and planned to lock her in a padded cell. She collapsed onto the floor, sobbing with a primal, agonizing grief that tore at my soul. I knelt beside her, holding her tightly while she mourned the death of her marriage and the illusion of her life. I let her cry until there were no tears left. But when Kendra finally lifted her head, the fragile, terrified woman who had cowered in the dining room was completely gone. The synthetic fog of the hormone blockers seemed to burn away, replaced by an intense, radiating clarity. Her tear-stained eyes hardened into dark, unyielding obsidian. Her grief rapidly transformed into an absolute unbridled fury. She stood up, her posture suddenly rigid and commanding. She looked at the photos of Brad and Vanessa, then looked at me with a cold, lethal determination. She did not ask why I had hidden my wealth. She did not ask how I got the files. She only asked what we were going to do to him. I stood up beside her, matching her fierce resolve. I told her we were not just going to divorce him or sue him. We were going to obliterate him. We were going to dismantle his company, seize his assets, and send him to federal prison. Father and daughter locked hands in the center of that penthouse, forging an unbreakable pact to exact the most ruthless revenge imaginable. Our moment of fierce determination was abruptly shattered by the shrill, blaring sound of the penthouse intercom system. The digital screen on the wall lit up, flashing an emergency alert from the lobby security desk. I pressed the communication button, and the panicked voice of my head security guard filled the room. He told me that 3 heavily armed police cruisers had just blockaded the front entrance of the building. Brad had called the authorities and filed a frantic, fabricated report claiming that I had violently kidnapped his mentally unstable wife. But he did not stop there. Brad had weaponized the fake medical power of attorney document I had intentionally signed with a bogus alias earlier that day. He had convinced the responding officers and an accompanying emergency medical team that I was suffering from severe aggressive dementia and was a lethal threat to society. The security guard warned me that the police were currently demanding access to my private elevator. Brad was demanding that they breach my doors, place me in handcuffs, and drag me straight to a state-run psychiatric holding facility. The piercing, high-pitched wail of police sirens echoed loudly from the city streets below, piercing the thick glass windows of the penthouse. The trap was closing in on us. The heavy steel doors of my private elevator slid open with a soft, melodic chime, immediately followed by the chaotic rush of heavy boots stomping onto my imported hardwood floors. 3 uniformed police officers stormed into the penthouse, their hands resting cautiously on their duty weapons, their eyes scanning the room for a threat. Right behind them, a team of emergency medical technicians rolled in a heavy psychiatric transport gurney, holding thick nylon restraints ready for deployment. And lingering safely in the back of the group, flanked by his rented corrupt psychiatrist, was Brad. He had perfectly arranged his facial features into a mask of deep, agonizing sorrow for the benefit of the police. But the moment his eyes met mine over the officer's shoulders, his facade slipped entirely. A cruel, victorious smirk stretched across his face. He truly believed he had won. He pointed a trembling, dramatic finger at me, telling the lead officer that I was experiencing a violent psychotic break. He claimed I had dragged Kendra out of his home by force, holding her hostage in this unfamiliar apartment against her will. Kendra stood up from the sofa, her voice steady and clear, telling the officers that she was here entirely on her own free choice, and that she was in no danger whatsoever. but the corrupt psychiatrist stepped forward smoothly, interrupting her. He handed the lead officer the fraudulent medical power of attorney I had signed earlier that day. He declared that Kendra was suffering from extreme emotional trauma and that my supposedly deteriorating mind made me a lethal threat to her physical safety. The lead officer unclipped his metal handcuffs, stepping toward me with a stern, unforgiving expression, ordering me to place my hands behind my back for my own protection. Brad's smirk widened into a full, arrogant grin. He thought he was about to watch me get strapped to a gurney and hauled off to a locked ward in the dead of night. Before the officer could even raise the metal cuffs, the secondary elevator doors at the far end of the penthouse slid open. My corporate attorney, Richard Kensington, strode into the room like a silver-haired shark scenting blood in the water. Rick did not yell. He did not act frantic. He simply walked straight into the center of the armed officers, exuding the kind of absolute terrifying authority that only comes from decades of destroying powerful people in federal courtrooms. He placed a pristine leather briefcase on the glass coffee table and snapped it open. He asked the lead officer to pause his arrest and handed him a heavy embossed document. Rick announced that what the officer was holding was a comprehensive executive-level psychiatric evaluation conducted just 48 hours ago by the chief of neurology at the most prestigious federal hospital on the East Coast. The document legally and undeniably certified that my cognitive functions were not just perfectly intact, but operating in the top 1 percentile for my age. The lead officer stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes scanning the certified federal seals and the undeniable medical signatures on the crisp paper. Then Rick turned his lethal gaze toward Brad and his highly paid psychiatrist. Rick pulled a magnified copy of the medical power of attorney Brad had submitted to the police. He slammed it down onto the glass table. He pointed directly at the signature line. He loudly informed the police that the document was a complete laughable fabrication. He noted that the signature clearly read Augustine M. Wright, a fictitious entity that did not exist in any legal registry in the country. He explained that my legal name was Augustus, and that any lawyer or doctor who failed to verify a basic state identification before attempting to strip a man of his civil liberties was committing gross medical malpractice and federal fraud. Rick looked at the corrupt doctor, quietly suggesting that the medical board would be highly interested in his willingness to commit a perfectly sane man based on a forged signature. The doctor turned completely pale, instantly backing away from Brad and shrinking toward the exit. The absolute legal barricade Rick threw down was flawless. The officers immediately lowered their weapons, realizing they had been weaponized in a fraudulent domestic dispute. The atmosphere in the penthouse shifted violently. The lead officer turned his back on me and walked directly up to Brad. The officer's face was completely flushed with anger at being manipulated into conducting a false arrest. He handed the worthless power of attorney back to Brad, poking him hard in the chest with a thick finger. The officer warned Brad in a low, dangerous voice that filing a false police report, attempting to fraudulently commit a senior citizen, and wasting city emergency resources were severe criminal offenses that carried mandatory jail time. He told Brad that the only reason he was not leaving this penthouse in handcuffs right now was because I had generously decided not to press formal charges yet. The paramedics, realizing they had been dragged into an illegal scam, quickly packed up their heavy restraints and rolled the gurney straight out the door without looking back. Brad was completely humiliated in front of the authorities. His grand theatrical plan to lock me away had spectacularly blown up in his face. He stumbled backward, his face turning a blotchy, furious shade of red. He looked at Kendra, demanding she leave with him immediately, but my daughter simply glared at him with absolute icy disgust. She told him she was filing for a protective order the moment the sun came up and that he was never to come near her again. Brad realized he had lost physical control of the situation. He could not use force. He could not use the police. So he resorted to the only weapon he thought he still had: his money. He straightened his ruined suit jacket, puffing out his chest in a desperate attempt to salvage his shattered ego. He looked around my luxurious penthouse, sneering as if the multi-million-dollar view meant absolutely nothing to him. He pointed a shaking finger at my face, his voice echoing with desperate arrogance. He told me that a fancy lawyer and a nice apartment would not save me from what was coming. He bragged that he was a rising titan in the tech industry, a man of extreme wealth and limitless resources. He promised he would bury me in civil litigation, drain my bank accounts, and completely ruin Kendra's veterinary practice. He swore he would crush us both under the sheer weight of his massive fortune. Right in the middle of his pathetic screaming tantrum, Brad's cell phone began to ring loudly. He snatched it from his pocket, ready to decline the call, but paused when he saw the caller ID. It was his executive secretary. He answered the phone, roughly demanding to know why she was interrupting him at this hour. I watched closely as his angry expression suddenly morphed into a look of absolute, unhinged ecstasy. His eyes widened and a greedy, victorious grin spread across his face. He put the phone on speaker so the entire room could hear. His secretary's voice echoed through the penthouse, excitedly announcing that the massive venture capital firm Apex Holdings had just officially approved his funding application. They were ready to wire $10 million directly into his startup's corporate accounts by the end of the week. Brad threw his head back and laughed maniacally. He looked at me with pure, unfiltered triumph. He boasted that $10 million was about to hit his bank and he was going to use every single cent to destroy my life and leave Kendra with absolutely nothing. He turned on his heel and marched into the elevator, cackling like a madman. He had absolutely no idea that I was the sole owner and chairman of Apex Holdings, and he had just stepped blindly into the most devastating financial bear trap ever constructed. The morning sun glared off the floor-to-ceiling windows of Rick's Wall Street office. I sat across the massive mahogany desk from my attorney, nursing a black coffee while we reviewed the final term sheet for Apex Holdings' $10 million investment in Brad's startup. We were not just drafting a standard financial agreement, we were building a corporate guillotine. Rick smiled, a predatory, ruthless grin as he typed rapidly on his keyboard, inserting a series of lethal financial traps deep into the labyrinth of standard corporate jargon. We added a severe cross-default provision that tied his business assets directly to his personal liabilities. We embedded an accelerated recall clause that allowed Apex to demand immediate full repayment of the entire principal if any fraudulent activity was detected within the corporate structure. I instructed Rick to make the emergency bridge loan contingent on a total unconditional asset pledge. Brad was so desperate to secure the initial cash injection before the grand gala that he would absolutely skip standard due diligence. We knew his startup was hemorrhaging money to the illegal gambling syndicate. He needed liquidity immediately to keep the criminal sharks off his back and to fund his lavish escape plan with his mistress. Rick printed the final contract, the paper warm from the machine, and slid it across the desk. It was a flawless legal snare. If Brad signed this document, he would voluntarily surrender the legal rights to every single thing he owned the moment we triggered the trap. I authorized Rick to send the digital packet to Brad's inferior legal team, knowing full well his arrogant lawyers would skim the dense text and urge their arrogant client to sign. By noon, my encrypted phone buzzed with an update from Dexter. He had intercepted the communications between Brad and his legal counsel. Exactly as we predicted, Brad was completely blinded by the sheer magnitude of the $10 million figure. He did not care about the restrictive covenants or the aggressively worded collateral requirements. He was driven entirely by his own colossal ego and his desperate need to appease the violent syndicate demanding their laundered cash. To access a $2 million emergency bridge loan before the official disbursement at the upcoming gala, Brad had to provide a massive personal guarantee. Dexter sent a live video feed from a camera he had discreetly placed near the conference room of Brad's office building. I watched on my screen as Brad sat at the head of his boardroom table, his chest puffed out in supreme arrogance. His lawyers weakly attempted to warn him about the aggressive nature of the personal asset pledge, pointing out that it bypassed standard limited liability protections. Brad silenced them instantly with a harsh, dismissive wave of his hand. He boasted loudly that Apex Holdings was practically begging to invest in his genius, and that standard collateral clauses were just formalities for a man of his rising stature. Without a second ounce of hesitation, Brad took his expensive fountain pen and signed his name on the dotted line. In his blind haste to secure the bridge loan, he legally mortgaged his entire existence to my holding company. He pledged his luxury vehicles, he pledged his corporate bank accounts, but most importantly, he pledged the $2 million hidden mansion where his mistress Vanessa was currently living. He actively signed away the estate he had bought with my dead wife's stolen trust fund, handing the ultimate deed of ownership directly back to me. He truly believed he had outsmarted the entire financial system. He thought he was untouchable, coasting on the brink of unimaginable wealth. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed the executioner the exact rope needed to hang him. While Brad was busy mortgaging his life to my anonymous corporation, Kendra was executing her own highly dangerous phase of our operation. I drove her back to the suburban house she had fled the night before. We sat in the idling truck for a moment, exchanging a look of absolute unified resolve. She wiped away any trace of the fierce, empowered woman she had become in my penthouse. She expertly forced her shoulders to slump, let her hands tremble, and painted her face with a mask of total, pathetic submission. She stepped out of the truck and walked up to the front door, slipping seamlessly back into the role of the broken, terrified wife. I watched through the encrypted security feed Dexter had hacked into their home network. Brad was sitting in the living room, pouring himself a glass of expensive bourbon to celebrate his newly acquired bridge loan. When Kendra walked through the door, tears streaming down her face, he did not offer a single word of comfort. He sneered at her, demanding to know why she had returned after embarrassing him in front of the police. Kendra fell to her knees, sobbing out a meticulously crafted apology. She told him she was terrified of my supposed mental breakdown. She claimed I had kidnapped her in a delusional state and that she had finally escaped my grasp to return to the only man who truly cared for her safety. Brad's massive ego devoured every single lie. He thrived on her simulated weakness. He took another sip of bourbon, looking down at her with pure, unfiltered condescension. He told her he would graciously allow her to remain in his house, but only if she proved her absolute loyalty immediately. He marched over to his briefcase and pulled out the final transfer documents for her veterinary clinic. He demanded she sign over the last remaining shares of her business to him right then and there, claiming he needed the assets to finalize his massive new corporate structure before the gala. Kendra nodded meekly, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor, perfectly playing the part of a woman who had completely surrendered her will to an abusive master. Feeling entirely victorious, Brad left the transfer documents on the glass table and announced he was going upstairs to take a long shower before his evening meetings. He ordered Kendra to have the papers signed and ready by the time he came back down. The absolute second the bathroom door clicked shut and the sound of running water echoed through the large house, Kendra's submissive facade vanished completely. She sprang up from the floor, her movements fast, precise, and entirely lethal. She rushed straight into Brad's private home office and locked the heavy wooden door behind her. She pulled a specialized military-grade decryption USB drive from her pocket provided directly by Dexter earlier that morning. She jammed the drive into the side of Brad's primary desktop computer. The screen immediately lit up, and a progress bar appeared as the drive began aggressively downloading every single hidden file, including the illegal gambling syndicate's money laundering ledgers and his encrypted offshore bank accounts. The download bar crossed 50%, then 70%. But just as it hit 90%, the screen suddenly flashed a harsh, blinding red. A massive security error message popped up blocking the final transfer. An automated piercing security alarm began blaring through the computer speakers, echoing loudly enough to be heard clearly over the sound of the running shower upstairs. The water immediately shut off, and heavy, urgent footsteps began pounding across the ceiling directly toward the stairs. The sound of heavy, frantic footsteps pounded against the hardwood stairs, rushing directly toward the home office. The computer security alarm continued its high-pitched shriek, completely destroying the quiet atmosphere of the house. The screen flashed a harsh red warning as the progress bar stalled at 99%, the system suddenly detecting the unauthorized extraction. Kendra had only microseconds to react. Her heart slammed against her ribs, but the fierce resolve we had forged in my penthouse kept her hands perfectly steady. She gripped the metal edge of the military-grade USB drive and yanked it out of the computer port. She shoved the small metal device deep into the hidden pocket of her slacks. She spun around, grabbed a microfiber cloth resting on the edge of a bookshelf, and immediately began wiping down the polished surface of Brad's massive oak desk. She forced her breathing to slow, painting her face with an expression of startled, submissive fear. The locked office door was violently kicked open, the wood splintering slightly around the frame. Brad burst into the room. He was dripping wet, a towel hastily wrapped around his waist, his face flushed with pure, unhinged paranoia. He glared at Kendra, his chest heaving as the automated security siren continued to blare from the desktop speakers. He lunged forward violently, shoving Kendra out of the way. She stumbled backward, hitting the bookshelf and letting out a perfectly calculated gasp of fear. Brad slammed his hands onto the keyboard, his eyes darting frantically across the glowing monitor. He demanded to know exactly what she was doing in his private sanctuary and why the system alert was triggering. Kendra shrank against the wall, clutching the cloth to her chest, playing the role of the terrified, broken wife he expected her to be. Brad frantically clicked through his system logs, desperate to find a data breach. But Dexter was a former federal agent who wrote surveillance code for the government. The USB drive was equipped with an aggressive ghost protocol. The exact millisecond Kendra pulled the drive from the port, the software actively scrubbed its own digital footprint, erasing every single trace of the massive download. Brad stared at the screen as the blaring alarm suddenly deactivated on its own. A generic harmless operating system update error popped up in its place. Brad narrowed his eyes, his breathing heavy, clearly still suspicious. He turned his terrifying glare back to my daughter, stepping closer to her with his fists clenched. He asked her again, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, why she had locked the door and what she was doing near his workstation. Kendra did not break character. She let a few tears spill over her eyelashes, trembling as she reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out the thick stack of legal documents Brad had left on the living room table earlier. It was the total transfer of ownership for her veterinary clinic. She held the papers out to him with shaking hands. She softly told him she only came into the office to find his favorite fountain pen because she wanted to leave the signed documents directly on his desk to make him proud. Brad stopped in his tracks. His greedy eyes locked onto the signature line at the bottom of the top page. Kendra had meticulously signed the document, but just like my maneuver with the medical power of attorney, she used a legally void alias, a subtle but fatal variation of her legal name that rendered the entire contract utterly worthless. But Brad was far too blinded by his own massive ego and his desperate thirst for power to scrutinize the ink. He snatched the papers from her trembling hands, flipping through the pages to confirm the signatures were there. A cruel, triumphant smirk replaced the paranoid rage on his face. He actually believed he had just successfully stolen her entire livelihood. He folded the documents, patted her condescendingly on the cheek, and told her to get out of his office and make herself useful in the kitchen. Kendra kept her head bowed and walked out of the office, moving with the slow, defeated shuffle of a completely broken woman. She maintained that agonizingly slow pace all the way through the front door and down the long, manicured driveway. But the absolute second she stepped out of the view of the house security cameras, her posture snapped upright. She broke into a fast, determined sprint toward the end of the street where my rusted pickup truck was idling in the shadows. She ripped the passenger door open and climbed inside, gasping for air, a fierce, triumphant smile spreading across her face. Dexter was sitting in the back seat, his high-powered laptop already booted up and ready. Kendra reached into her pocket, pulled out the sleek metal USB drive, and dropped it directly into Dexter's waiting hand. Dexter immediately plugged the drive into his system and began running a heavy decryption sequence. For 2 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the truck was the hum of the engine and the rapid clicking of Dexter's keyboard. Then a massive cascade of digital files flooded his screen. We had it all. The Ghost Protocol had successfully bypassed Brad's firewall and extracted the entire Black Ledger. Dexter opened the spreadsheets, his eyes widening as he scrolled through the raw data. He pointed to the specific routing numbers connecting Brad's tech startup directly to the violent sports betting syndicate. He pulled up the fraudulent invoices Brad had generated using Kendra's clinic, detailing exactly how millions in dirty gambling cash had been washed through fake surgical procedures. The evidence was absolutely irrefutable. We had the exact transaction dates, the hidden offshore account numbers, and the digital footprints linking him directly to organized crime. We had total, undeniable proof of massive federal money laundering, wire fraud, and grand larceny. Brad was no longer just an abusive, arrogant son-in-law. In the eyes of the law, he was a highly compromised criminal operating a massive financial syndicate. The trap was fully loaded, and the evidence was completely bulletproof. We drove away from the suburban neighborhood, leaving Brad alone in his house, completely unaware that he was officially a dead man walking. Later that afternoon, a digital invitation arrived in my secure inbox. It was an exclusive VIP pass to the massive, highly publicized launch gala for Brad's new application taking place tomorrow night at a luxury 5-star hotel downtown. Dexter intercepted the private security manifest for the high-profile event. Brad had explicitly flagged my name and photograph to his armed security team, placing a strict, unconditional ban on the old, dirty father-in-law entering the premises under any circumstances. But the most sickening detail came from a decrypted text exchange between Brad and his mistress Vanessa. Brad promised her that tomorrow night would be their ultimate glorious victory. He bragged that the exact second he officially signed the $10 million investment deal with Apex Holdings on the main stage, he was going to take the microphone and publicly humiliate Kendra. He planned to announce their divorce to the entire crowd of elite investors, completely destroy her professional reputation, and bring Vanessa onto the stage to unveil her as his true wealthy partner. He was setting up a spectacular, ruthless public execution for my daughter. He wanted a grand finale to feed his massive ego. He had absolutely no idea that I was the one writing the ending to this story, and his beautiful stage was about to become a complete financial slaughterhouse. The grand ballroom of the opulent five-star hotel downtown was a glittering sea of extreme excess and stolen wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a dazzling fractured light over hundreds of tech investors, venture capitalists, and high society elites. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated effortlessly with heavy silver trays loaded with premium imported champagne and expensive hors d'oeuvres. At the very center of this fabricated empire stood Brad. He was dressed in a custom-tailored velvet tuxedo, his chest puffed out with the supreme arrogance of a man who firmly believed he had successfully conned the entire financial world. He stood near the edge of the main stage, checking his diamond Rolex every few minutes, eagerly waiting for the elusive representative from Apex Holdings to arrive and hand him his $10 million crown. Down on the polished marble floor, his parents were holding court. They paraded around the crowded room with sickening pride, loudly bragging to anyone who would listen about their brilliant visionary son. They completely ignored the fact that his entire empire was built on a foundation of severe fraud, money laundering, and domestic abuse. Floating through the crowd, completely unbothered by her actual status as a secret mistress, was Vanessa. She was draped in a skin-tight emerald gown and practically blinded the nearby guests with the massive, flawless diamond necklace wrapped tightly around her throat. It was a necklace paid for entirely by the trust fund my late wife had left for Kendra. Vanessa strutted past the wealthy investors, sipping champagne and acting as if she were already the undisputed queen of this tech dynasty. She threw condescending smiles at the hotel staff, thoroughly enjoying the lavish lifestyle she had stolen from my family. It was a sickening display of pure, unfiltered greed, a room full of monsters celebrating a victory that was about to turn to ash in their mouths. Less than a block away, parked quietly in the deep shadows of the towering skyscrapers, sat my matte black Rolls-Royce Phantom. The heavy bulletproof glass shielded us entirely from the bustling city outside. Inside the quiet leather-lined cabin, the atmosphere was thick with cold, calculating anticipation. I was no longer the hunched, defeated old man wearing faded flannels and scuffed work boots. I wore a masterfully tailored pitch-black Italian tuxedo that fit my broad shoulders perfectly. A crisp silk bow tie sat at my collar and a heavy platinum watch peeked out from under my cuff. I had permanently shed the impoverished disguise I wore for years. The king had finally returned to his throne. Sitting beside me in the spacious back seat was Kendra, and her transformation was nothing short of breathtaking. The terrified, hollowed-out woman who had cowered on a kitchen floor just 48 hours ago was completely gone. Tonight, she was a fierce warrior. She wore an absolutely stunning, floor-length crimson-red dress that radiated fierce, unapologetic power. Her dark hair was styled in an elegant, sweeping updo, and her makeup perfectly highlighted the sharp, determined contours of her face. The heavy, toxic fog of the synthetic hormones had entirely lifted, replaced by a lethal, razor-sharp clarity. She sat tall, her spine perfectly straight, her dark eyes locked intensely onto the glowing tablet resting on the center console. Dexter had successfully hacked into the hotel's main surveillance feed, routing the live video directly to our secure screen. We sat in the luxurious silence of the vehicle, watching the glittering ballroom feed in real time. We watched Brad warmly shake hands with billionaires. We watched his parents boast loudly to the press. We watched Vanessa flaunt the stolen diamonds without a shred of guilt. Kendra did not shed a single tear. She did not flinch or look away. She simply watched the high-definition screen with the icy, calculated gaze of an apex predator observing its prey. I reached over and gently placed my hand over hers. Her grip was incredibly firm and steady. She looked at me, a fierce, knowing smile touching the corners of her deep red lips. We were fully synchronized, 2 generations of unbreakable strength preparing to execute a flawless financial demolition. The long wait was over, and the time for absolute reckoning had finally arrived. Through the intercepted audio feed on Dexter's tablet, I could clearly hear the security chatter crackling over the hotel team's private radio channel. Brad had left absolutely nothing to chance. He had specifically hired a private, heavily armed security firm to tightly monitor the perimeter of the Grand Gala. The lead security director's voice barked aggressively over the encrypted frequency, explicitly reminding his guards stationed at every single entry point to remain on high alert. Brad had provided them with a highly detailed, extremely insulting description of me. The guards were explicitly ordered to forcefully eject an elderly black man wearing cheap, worn-out clothing who might attempt to crash the prestigious venue. Brad had labeled me a mentally unstable, highly aggressive vagrant who was strictly banned from stepping foot on the premises. He had legally weaponized the private security force to ensure his perfect fraudulent night would not be ruined by the father-in-law he so deeply despised. Inside the grand ballroom, the glittering crowd began to quiet down as the elegant jazz music faded into a low, expectant hum. Brad confidently walked up the carpeted steps to the center of the massive stage. The bright spotlights instantly tracked his every movement, illuminating his smug, arrogant face for the entire room to see. He stepped up to the crystal podium, tapping his silver spoon against a highly polished champagne flute. The sharp ringing sound immediately captured the attention of every wealthy investor and journalist in the room. Brad raised his glass high into the air, a picture of supreme, untouchable triumph. He spoke smoothly into the microphone, delivering a meticulously rehearsed speech about his unparalleled tech genius, his tireless dedication to innovation, and the massive financial revolution his company was about to launch. He thanked his enabling parents for their endless support and guidance. He even had the sheer brazen audacity to make a vague romantic gesture toward Vanessa, who beamed at him from the front row, completely solidifying his sickening intention to humiliate Kendra publicly the exact moment the Apex funding was fully secured. He confidently promised the crowded room that this night marked the permanent elevation of his legacy. He toasted to his own unstoppable success, completely oblivious to the massive destructive storm gathering just outside the hotel doors. I gave a brief silent nod to my private driver. The massive engine of the Rolls-Royce roared to life with a deep, intimidating growl. The vehicle smoothly pulled out of the dark alleyway and glided aggressively toward the front entrance of the luxury hotel. We bypassed the busy valet line entirely, the heavy black car pulling to a sudden commanding halt directly beneath the brightly lit grand marquee of the main lobby. The sudden disruptive arrival of the imposing vehicle immediately drew the attention of the private security team stationed at the heavy glass doors. 4 large, heavily muscled guards in dark suits instantly stiffened their hands, dropping defensively to their utility belts as they moved rapidly to intercept. The driver quickly stepped out and pulled open my heavy rear door. I stepped out onto the polished pavement, adjusting my silk bow tie, standing tall and unyielding under the bright hotel lights. Kendra stepped out right behind me, her crimson dress flowing elegantly in the cool evening breeze. One of the security guards immediately recognized my face from the banned list Brad had provided to the team. He shouted a harsh, aggressive command into his radio, signaling the other guards to move in. They lunged forward simultaneously, their faces aggressive and hostile, fully intending to violently tackle the supposedly crazy old vagrant to the concrete before he could take another step toward the ballroom. Before the largest guard could even lay a hand on my tailored tuxedo, a sleek silver sedan screeched to a sudden halt right behind my vehicle. The heavy doors flew open, and my corporate attorney Richard Kensington stepped out into the harsh hotel security lights. Rick moved with the lethal speed and precision of a striking viper. He stepped directly between me and the charging security detail. He did not raise his hands in defense or shout for them to stop. He simply reached into his expensive coat and whipped out a heavy solid gold VIP identification lanyard. He slammed the metal badge directly into the chest of the lead security director with punishing force. The large guard stumbled back, his aggressive posture faltering as his eyes dropped to the heavily embossed crest gleaming brightly under the marquee lights. It was the absolute highest-level executive credential for Apex Holdings, the massive venture capital firm that was literally funding this entire gala and paying the salaries of every person working in the building. Rick looked the security director dead in the eye and spoke with a voice like cracking ice. He informed the guards that they were currently attempting to physically assault the supreme chairman of the board for Apex Holdings. He warned them that if a single finger touched my suit, he would personally ensure their security firm was bankrupt by morning and every man present would face severe federal charges for corporate assault. The reaction was instantaneous and entirely humiliating for Brad's carefully laid defensive plans. The color completely drained from the security director's face. He looked at the heavy gold badge, looked at Rick, and then looked at me, standing tall, silent, and entirely unbothered. The director frantically barked an immediate abort order into his radio. The charging guards stopped dead in their tracks, their aggressive hostility evaporating into sheer trembling panic. They immediately stepped back, pressing themselves flat against the glass walls of the entrance to clear the path. The security director bowed his head in deep, terrified submission, throwing the main glass doors wide open and gesturing nervously for us to enter. The impenetrable barricade Brad had built specifically to keep the dirty old man out had completely crumbled in less than 30 seconds. I turned to Kendra and offered her my arm. She wrapped her hand around my forearm, standing perfectly straight, radiating the fierce, untouchable grace of a queen returning to reclaim her stolen kingdom. We stepped through the heavy glass doors and walked side by side down the long, plush red carpet leading directly into the main ballroom. The grand double doors were held wide open by the terrified hotel staff. The moment we crossed the threshold, the sheer energy in the massive room shifted violently. Hundreds of wealthy investors, tech executives, and high society elites were happily chatting, drinking, and networking. But as we walked past the first row of elegantly decorated tables, the conversations began to die out. Heads turned one by one. The sight of a tall, imposing black man in a masterfully tailored tuxedo and a stunning woman in a commanding crimson dress completely disrupted the flow of the evening. The silence rippled through the massive crowd like a physical shockwave. The live jazz band playing softly in the corner faltered, the musicians noticing the sudden tense change in the atmosphere. The music completely stopped, leaving only the sound of our confident, synchronized footsteps echoing sharply against the polished marble floor. The wealthy crowd automatically parted, stepping back to create a wide, clear path leading straight to the main stage. We walked through the sea of elites, and I spotted Vanessa standing near the front. The moment she saw Kendra looking like royalty instead of the broken victim she was supposed to be, Vanessa physically shrank back, hiding her stolen diamond necklace behind a taller guest. Then we reached the center of the room, right where Brad's arrogant parents were holding court. They were busy laughing and drinking with a group of venture capitalists when they finally turned to see what had silenced the entire ballroom. Brad's father froze. His arrogant sneer melted instantly into an expression of absolute, uncomprehending horror. He looked at my face, recognizing the man he had verbally abused and mocked in a catering kitchen just a month prior. Brad's mother stared at Kendra, unable to process the powerful, radiant woman standing before her, instead of the heavily medicated, fearful victim they had left behind in the suburbs. The shock was so profound, so completely paralyzing, that Brad's father lost all feeling in his hands. The expensive crystal wine glass slipped right through his fingers. It hit the solid marble floor with a sharp, violent crash, sending a shower of deep red wine and shattered glass flying across their expensive designer shoes. The sharp sound echoed like a gunshot through the dead silent ballroom. They stood paralyzed, completely humiliated and terrified in front of their elite peers, while Kendra and I did not even break our stride. We walked right past their shattered glass, leaving them trembling in our wake as we marched purposefully toward the stage. Up on the brilliantly lit stage, Brad was completely unaware of the approaching storm until the sudden, heavy silence of the crowd forced him to look down. He had been practically glowing with triumph, waiting for the Apex Holdings representative to hand him his $10 million check. But when his cold blue eyes finally locked onto me walking down the center aisle with his wife on my arm, all the color violently drained from his face. He turned a sickly ashen shade of white. The confident visionary tech CEO vanished entirely, replaced by a terrified, cornered animal. He gripped the edges of the crystal podium, his knuckles turning bone white as his mind desperately tried to comprehend how the impoverished, powerless old man he had banned from the premises was now walking toward him like a royal executioner. Brad leaned away from the microphone and began frantically waving his hands toward the back of the room. He stammered wildly, his voice cracking as he screamed into the silent ballroom for his private security detail to step in and forcefully remove the intruders. He barked desperate orders, demanding to know how I had breached his perimeter and ordering the guards to drag me out into the street. But nobody moved. The security guards standing along the walls kept their heads down, completely unwilling to cross the man holding the ultimate VIP credential. The wealthy crowd watched in sheer fascination as the arrogant host of the evening suffered a complete, highly visible public meltdown. I let go of Kendra's arm at the base of the stairs, giving her a reassuring nod. She stood proudly at the front of the crowd, crossing her arms, her dark eyes piercing straight through Brad's rapidly collapsing ego. I walked up the carpeted steps of the stage with slow, deliberate precision. A well-dressed master of ceremonies stepped forward holding a clipboard, attempting to block my path and nervously asking for my credentials. I did not even look at him. I simply raised my hand and brushed past him with an aura of such absolute terrifying authority that he immediately stepped aside, completely intimidated. I walked right up to the crystal podium. Brad stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat, completely paralyzed by my proximity. I reached out and took the silver microphone directly from the stand, holding it firmly in my hand. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting for the explosion. Brad finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. Pure desperate panic flooded his veins. He lunged forward, reaching out with a trembling hand to violently snatch the microphone away from me. He hissed a frantic, venomous threat through clenched teeth, leaning in so only I could hear. He told me I was going to rot in a prison cell for ruining his massive investment night, promising to have me completely destroyed the moment the real Apex executives arrived. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I easily swatted his trembling hand away with a sharp flick of my wrist. I raised the microphone to my lips and looked out over the sea of wealthy investors, venture capitalists, and the utterly terrified faces of his enabling parents. Then I turned my head slightly, locking my cold, merciless gaze directly onto Brad's horrified eyes. I smiled, a freezing, lethal expression that completely shattered his fabricated world. "Good evening," I said, my voice booming through the massive sound system, echoing with absolute, undeniable power. "I am Augustus Wright, the sole owner and chairman of the board for Apex Holdings. I am the man to whom you just blindly mortgaged your entire life, your hidden assets, and your absolute freedom simply to borrow my money." Brad stood completely paralyzed. The breath was violently knocked out of his lungs. His cold blue eyes, previously wide with arrogant rage, now darted wildly around the room as if searching for a punchline to a joke that was never coming. His jaw worked silently, struggling to form words, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The sheer crushing weight of my statement hit him like a physical blow. He realized in real time that the poor, uneducated black man he had relentlessly mocked and tormented was the very titan holding the leash to his entire corporate existence. Down in the front row, the shift in power was instantly recognized by the most opportunistic person in the room. Vanessa took one look at my face, then looked at Brad's utterly broken posture on the stage. The false confidence she had worn all evening instantly evaporated. She practically melted into the shadows, taking quick, calculated steps backward. She slinked behind a large floral arrangement near the edge of the stage, desperately trying to distance herself from the sinking ship. A low, restless hum began to ripple through the grand ballroom. The hundreds of wealthy investors, venture capitalists, and tech elites did not get to their positions by being slow. They smelled blood in the water. The initial stunned silence rapidly dissolved into a fierce, aggressive wave of whispers and hushed conversations. Men in expensive suits leaned into each other, their eyes darting between my commanding presence at the podium and Brad's pathetic, trembling form. The elite crowd, who just moments ago had been ready to crown Brad as the next great visionary, were now actively calculating how quickly they could untangle their own funds from his completely compromised company. I gripped the edges of the crystal podium, letting the murmur of the crowd build before I spoke again. When my voice boomed through the speakers once more, it cut through the noise like a heavy steel blade. I formally announce as the absolute controlling authority of Apex Holdings that the $10 million venture capital disbursement scheduled for this evening is permanently canceled. The collective gasp from the ballroom was audible. Brad physically flinched, throwing his hands out in a desperate, silent plea. I did not break eye contact with the crowd. I informed the elite investors that Apex Holdings operates under a strict, non-negotiable zero-tolerance policy for corporate malfeasance. I stated clearly that during our final stage due diligence, my forensic accounting team uncovered a massive, undeniable web of severe financial fraud running through the very core of this startup. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored tuxedo and pulled out a sleek black leather folder provided by Rick. I opened it and held up a highly magnified certified bank document for the entire room to see. I declared that the man standing on this stage did not just lie to his investors, but he actively committed federal wire fraud to secure his initial capital. I explained that Brad had unlawfully seized a massive private trust fund belonging to his wife, my daughter, Kendra. I told the room that he had meticulously forged her legal signature on binding banking documents to drain millions of dollars from a highly protected account. I did not leave any room for ambiguity. I detailed how that stolen money was not used for corporate research or development, but was illegally funneled into an anonymous shell company to purchase a $2 million luxury estate for his secret mistress. The ballroom erupted. Outrage and shock flashed across the faces of the conservative board members and elite bankers sitting at the front tables. This was no longer just a dramatic family dispute. It was a massive radioactive financial crime unfolding live on a highly publicized stage. I stated that Apex Holdings would never fund a criminal enterprise, and by forging his wife's signature to steal her inheritance, Brad had instantly triggered the absolute termination clause of our investment agreement. The public exposure of his crimes finally snapped Brad out of his paralyzed state. Pure, desperate survival instinct took over. He lunged toward the center of the stage, his face flushed, a dark, angry purple beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He screamed into the open air, his voice cracking with unchecked panic. He shouted to the crowd that I was lying. He bellowed that I was a delusional, bitter old man trying to extort him out of jealousy. He wildly claimed that the documents were completely fabricated and that I was staging a malicious smear campaign to destroy his flawless reputation. He turned to the crowd, spreading his arms wide, begging his wealthy peers not to listen to the insane ramblings of a fraud. But his voice lacked all authority. It was the shrill, frantic screeching of a cornered rat. Down on the marble floor, his enabling parents were jolted into action by their son's desperate screams, driven by the same blinding, arrogant entitlement that had fueled their entire existence. They shoved their way through the crowd of shocked investors. Brad's father marched furiously toward the stage steps, his face twisted in a hateful snarl, completely disregarding the shattered wine glass he had dropped moments ago. His mother was right behind him, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger at me. They reached the base of the stage and began shouting over the murmuring crowd. Brad's father aggressively yelled that I was a complete fraud and imposter who had probably stolen the Apex credentials to pull off a psychotic stunt. He insulted my character, my background, and my intelligence right there in front of the city's financial elite. He demanded that the hotel security immediately arrest me for criminal trespass and severe corporate defamation. He loudly proclaimed that his son was an innocent, brilliant visionary, and that my entire family was nothing but a pack of opportunistic parasites trying to drag his perfect bloodline into the dirt. They created a massive, chaotic spectacle, fully believing their loud, privileged voices would automatically drown out the truth. I stood perfectly still at the podium, letting their frantic, racist insults wash over me. I did not raise my voice to argue. I did not stoop to their pathetic level of screaming. I simply looked past their red, furious faces and gave a short, subtle nod toward the tinted glass window of the elevated audio-visual control booth at the very back of the grand ballroom. Sitting securely behind that glass with full administrative access to the hotel's entire media mainframe was Dexter. He had infiltrated the technical team hours ago. Dexter saw my signal. Without a single second of hesitation, he reached forward and firmly pressed the execution key on his primary laptop. A heavy electronic hum suddenly vibrated through the floorboards. The massive high-definition LED screen stretching across the entire back wall of the stage, previously displaying Brad's sleek corporate logo, abruptly flickered to pitch black. The sudden shift in lighting plunged the stage into dramatic shadows, instantly silencing Brad's screaming parents. Then, with a sharp, brilliant flash that illuminated the entire ballroom, the giant screen flared back to life. The absolute, undeniable truth was no longer just a stack of papers in my hand. It was now broadcast in 50-foot high resolution for every billionaire journalist and investor in the room to witness. The ultimate financial slaughter had officially begun. The massive 50-foot LED screen dominating the back wall of the stage snapped into crisp, blinding focus. Instead of the sleek, modern logo of Brad's highly anticipated tech startup, the display projected a live, high-resolution mirror of a federal banking interface. The entire ballroom gasped in unison as bright, blood-red letters flashed across the screen in bold, undeniable text. Account frozen. Assets seized. I gripped the crystal podium and leaned into the microphone, my voice echoing like thunder across the grand hall. I announced that the venture capital contract Brad signed with Apex Holdings just 24 hours ago contained a very specific, highly lethal accelerated recall clause. I explained to the captivated audience of billionaires and elite investors that this clause gave my corporation the absolute unilateral legal right to to demand the immediate full repayment of the $2 million bridge loan if any fraudulent activity was detected. Because Brad had brazenly lied on his financial disclosures and forged his wife's signature to secure the initial collateral, he had instantly violated federal law and breached the ironclad covenants of our binding agreement. I declared that Apex Holdings had officially triggered the recall. The legal mechanism was already fully in motion. Every single bank connected to his name had received the federal injunctions precisely at the start of this gala. He was completely locked out of his own life. Brad turned around slowly, his entire body trembling violently as he stared up at the towering screen. The smug, untouchable CEO was completely gone, replaced by a terrified, hyperventilating fraud watching his fabricated empire collapse in real time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, frantically trying to log into his banking apps, only to be met with bright red access, denied notifications on every single screen. The giant screen above us shifted, cutting away from the primary banking interface to display a highly detailed, itemized list of Brad's entire personal and corporate portfolio. I did not give him a single second to catch his breath. I read his catastrophic financial reality out loud for the entire room of elites to hear. First, the deed to the sprawling $2 million luxury mansion he had purchased for his secret mistress flashed onto the screen. A massive red stamp materialized over the document reading "Legally Repossessed." Next came the registration documents for his fleet of luxury European sports cars. I informed the silent, captivated ballroom that federal recovery agents were currently towing those vehicles out of the hotel parking garage as we spoke. The screen then cycled to the corporate operating accounts for his tech startup, the very accounts these wealthy investors were about to pour $10 million into. The balances were completely wiped, locked down by federal authorities due to the ongoing investigation into his ties with the illegal sports betting syndicate. I projected the massive illegal gambling debts he owed to violent criminals, followed by the enormous penalty fees he now owed Apex Holdings for breaching his personal guarantee. I directed everyone's attention to the massive digital counter displayed at the very bottom of the screen. It was a real-time calculation of Bradley Sutton's exact net worth. The numbers spun rapidly, dropping from a fabricated positive valuation down to zero in a matter of seconds. But the counter did not stop there. It kept spinning backward, plunging deep into the negative digits. It crashed through -1 million, then -2 million, finally coming to a dead stop at a staggering -$4.5 million. I looked directly at Brad, who was visibly shaking, sweating profusely through his custom velvet tuxedo. I told him he was no longer a tech visionary or a rising star in the financial world. I declared that he was officially bankrupt, stripped of his stolen assets, and drowning in a suffocating ocean of unpayable debt. I had meticulously dismantled his entire financial existence in front of the most powerful people in the city. Down in the front row, the devastating reality of the glowing numbers crashed heavily upon the one person whose loyalty was bought and paid for. Vanessa stared up at the massive LED screen, her eyes wide with absolute horror as the image of her luxurious hidden mansion was branded with the bright red repossession stamp. Her lavish stolen lifestyle was evaporating right in front of her eyes. She frantically pulled her own designer smartphone from her jeweled clutch, her long manicured fingers flying across the screen as she checked the secondary credit accounts Brad had set up for her. Every single one of them was permanently locked. The stolen trust fund money she had been burning through for over a year was completely gone. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was tethered to a sinking ship, and the captain was deeply in debt to violent criminals and federal authorities. Vanessa did not offer Brad a single shred of comfort. She did not rush to the stage to defend the man she supposedly loved. Instead, her face twisted into a mask of pure, self-serving fury. She marched directly up to the edge of the stage, her emerald gown catching the harsh security lights. She glared up at Brad, who was currently hyperventilating and clutching his chest. Vanessa reached up to her hand and violently yanked the massive, expensive diamond engagement ring off her finger. She drew her arm back and hurled the heavy piece of jewelry directly at Brad's face. The ring struck him squarely in the cheek, leaving a bright red mark before clattering loudly onto the polished wooden stage. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her shrill voice carrying easily over the murmurs of the shocked crowd. She called him a pathetic, incompetent fraud. She cursed him for dragging her into a federal investigation and shouted that he was nothing but a broke, useless liar. Without a single look back, Vanessa turned on her heel and sprinted toward the main exit. She aggressively shoved her way past the bewildered billionaires and tech executives, abandoning Brad to his spectacular ruin to save her own skin. Brad dropped heavily to his knees on the hard wooden stage. He scrambled pathetically across the floorboards, desperately searching for the discarded diamond ring, as if it were the last remaining life raft in a churning ocean. He was a completely broken man, publicly humiliated by his mistress and financially annihilated in front of his elite peers. Down on the marble floor, his arrogant parents stood frozen in absolute shock, their mouths hanging open, utterly speechless as their son's grand legacy was violently erased. I gripped the crystal podium and spoke into the microphone once more, my voice commanding the total attention of the silent ballroom. I told Brad that financial ruin was simply the business penalty for his corporate crimes. But the money was never the most important part of this reckoning. I reminded him that he had chosen to disrespect my family physically, abuse my daughter, and insult my heritage. The debt for his personal sins had not yet been paid. I looked past the stage, giving one final subtle nod to the audio-visual control booth. Dexter immediately pressed the execution key on his laptop. The massive LED screen flickered again. The overwhelming spreadsheets and negative bank balances instantly vanished. The screen transitioned to a new high-definition video file. The financial slaughter was officially over, but the total annihilation of his family's honor was just about to begin. The massive screen behind Brad flickered and came to life with pristine, high-definition clarity. The cold spreadsheets were gone, replaced by a brightly lit, intimate video recorded secretly inside a luxury hotel suite. The audio piped through the ballroom speakers, sharp and inescapable. On the screen, Brad lounged on a plush velvet sofa, wearing a white bathrobe, holding a glass of champagne. Vanessa was draped across his lap. They were laughing hysterically. The entire ballroom watched as Vanessa asked Brad how much longer he was going to keep funding his parents' lavish lifestyle. Brad snorted with pure, unfiltered contempt. His voice echoed through the silent hall, dripping with arrogance. He called his own mother and father pathetic, useless freeloaders. He bragged to his mistress that his parents were nothing but broke, desperate leeches who relied entirely on his bank accounts to maintain their fake status at the local country club. He mocked his father for acting like a self-made titan of industry, when in reality he could not even afford the payments on his own luxury car without begging his son for cash. Brad laughed cruelly on the video, declaring that the moment he secured his massive venture capital funding, he was going to cut them off completely and let them drown in their own debt. He called them an embarrassing burden, a pair of aging parasites who had contributed absolutely nothing to his brilliant success. The sheer venom in his voice was devastating. He was stripping away the very foundation of his family pride, exposing their supposed wealth as a total, humiliating illusion. Down on the polished marble floor of the ballroom, the social execution was absolute. Brad's father, who just moments ago had been shouting racist insults at me and demanding my arrest, now stood completely frozen. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, pale gray. His jaw hung open in silent, uncomprehending agony as he listened to his own son publicly obliterate his dignity. Brad's mother let out a sharp, breathless gasp, pressing her trembling hands over her mouth as tears of profound shame streamed down her heavily made-up face. The elite crowd surrounding them reacted with immediate, brutal efficiency. High society is ruthless, and the smell of a fraudulent, broke family is an unforgivable offense. The venture capitalist country club members and wealthy socialites who had been drinking their champagne and laughing at their jokes just an hour ago now recoiled as if the couple carried a highly contagious disease. Disgust washed over the faces of the elite guests. Whispers of absolute contempt rapidly spread through the crowd. A prominent tech billionaire standing next to Brad's father gave him a look of pure revulsion, deliberately turned his back and walked away. The movement triggered a massive chain reaction. One by one, the wealthy investors, the board members, and the elite associates turned their backs on the disgraced parents. No one offered a word of comfort. No one extended a hand. The parents were instantly isolated, standing completely alone in a widening circle of empty space on the ballroom floor. Brad's mother tried to reach out to a woman she had called her best friend for years, but the woman coldly swatted her hand away, grabbing her silk purse and joining the mass exodus. Several high-profile guests began marching straight toward the heavy glass exit doors, pulling out their phones to instruct their assistants to sever all ties with the Sutton family. The parents were experiencing the ultimate social slaughter. They were ruined, stripped of their fake prestige, and reduced to the pathetic freeloaders their own son had named them. They stood trembling in the center of the room, completely crushed under the weight of their spectacular, highly public humiliation. As the crowd continued to turn away from the disgraced parents in utter disgust, Kendra stepped forward from the edge of the stage. The entire room fell into a breathless, terrifying silence as she moved. Her crimson dress swept across the polished wooden floorboards as she walked directly toward the center of the stage where Brad was still kneeling. He looked up at her with red, desperate eyes, his hands trembling violently. He opened his mouth desperately, trying to formulate a pathetic apology, trying to salvage whatever tiny fragment of control he thought he had left. Kendra did not give him the chance to speak a single word. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents. With a swift, powerful motion, she threw the heavy stack directly into Brad's face. The papers hit him hard, scattering across the stage floor around his knees. Right on top of the pile was a finalized, aggressively worded petition for absolute divorce. But Kendra was not finished. She stood tall, her voice ringing out across the vast ballroom with a fierce, unbreakable power. She commanded the attention of every single person still standing in the room. She pointed down at the scattered papers and loudly declared that Brad was not just a financial fraud, but a domestic monster. She pulled the certified medical reports from her pocket and held them high in the air. She announced to the entire crowd that her husband had secretly undergone a vasectomy 2 years ago. She detailed with brutal, unwavering clarity how he had intentionally hidden his sterilization while forcing her to endure agonizing invasive fertility treatments. She exposed the toxic synthetic hormone blockers he had disguised as supplements, explaining to the horrified audience that he had actively poisoned her body and systematically destroyed her mental health just to keep her submissive and broken. The collective gasp from the remaining guests was deafening. Even the most hardened corporate sharks in the room stared at Brad with sheer, unfiltered revulsion. Kendra looked down at the trembling, ruined man at her feet. She told him that he was a pathetic, empty shell of a human being. She declared that he had no power over her, no claim to her life, and that she was walking away from his toxic existence forever. She branded him a monster, leaving him absolutely stripped of any remaining shred of humanity. Kendra turned her back on the pathetic, kneeling man and walked proudly to my side. We stood together on the stage watching the total, irreversible destruction of Bradley Sutton. He was sobbing uncontrollably on the floorboards, desperately clutching the divorce papers and the forged bank documents, completely broken by the sheer magnitude of his own consequences. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket of finality. But that silence was abruptly shattered. A piercing, high-pitched wail suddenly echoed from the busy city streets outside. The sound multiplied rapidly, growing louder and more intense by the second. The flashing, frantic reflection of bright red and blue emergency lights began to bounce aggressively against the towering floor-to-ceiling windows of the Grand Hotel ballroom. The deafening screech of multiple sirens signaled that the final phase of our meticulously planned operation had officially arrived. The massive heavy glass doors at the main entrance of the ballroom were violently thrown open. The terrified hotel staff jumped out of the way as dozens of uniformed local police officers and heavily armed federal agents stormed into the grand hall. Their tactical boots pounded against the polished marble, their hands resting securely on their weapons, their eyes scanning the room with lethal intent. They moved with absolute organized precision, forming a tight, inescapable perimeter around the entire venue. The ultimate inescapable reckoning had finally breached the doors, and there was absolutely nowhere left for Brad to run. The heavy tactical boots of the federal agents echoed like a rhythmic drumbeat against the polished marble floor as they cut a direct, unforgiving path through the stunned crowd of elites. The local police chief, accompanied by a senior FBI special agent wearing a dark tactical windbreaker, marched straight up the carpeted steps of the stage. They did not pause to acknowledge the billionaires, the venture capitalists, or the high society socialites. Their eyes were locked entirely on the pathetic, kneeling figure of Bradley Sutton. The police chief stepped forward, his hand resting firmly on his heavy utility belt, completely bypassing any standard pleasantries. His voice boomed over the residual silence of the ballroom, cold, authoritative, and strictly professional. He announced that he was officially executing a federal arrest warrant issued directly by the United States District Court. He stated the charges loud and clear for every single person in the grand room to hear. Bradley Sutton was officially being indicted for massive federal money laundering, severe banking fraud conspiracy to commit wire fraud and obtaining millions of dollars in property by false pretenses. The FBI agent stepped up right beside the chief, holding a thick, heavy folder containing the exact digital ledgers and offshore routing numbers Dexter had successfully extracted from Brad's highly encrypted private server. The federal agent declared that they possessed irrefutable hard evidence tying Brad directly to the violent sports betting syndicate, along with undeniable proof of the forged signatures he utilized to drain a protected private trust fund. The harsh, inescapable reality of federal prison descended heavily upon the illuminated stage. The arresting officers did not ask Brad to stand up. They did not offer him the quiet dignity of a private, discreet surrender. Two heavily armed federal agents moved in, swiftly grabbed him violently by the lapels of his custom velvet jacket, and forcefully hauled him up to his feet. The sharp, unforgiving click of cold metal handcuffs snapping shut around Brad's wrists echoed loudly into the silver microphone I still held firmly in my hand. That metallic, defining sound completely shattered whatever fragile, desperate delusion of escape Brad still harbored in his mind. The sheer crushing weight of his immediate future instantly collapsed his legs. He fell hard onto his knees, dragging the two federal agents down slightly with his sudden dead weight. The arrogant, visionary tech CEO was entirely gone. In his place was a sobbing, hyperventilating child facing the absolute ruin of his fabricated existence. Tears and sweat ruined his expensive face, dripping down his chin and heavily staining the collar of his custom-tailored shirt. He looked up at Kendra, his eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate terror. He begged her to call the authorities off. He pleaded with her to tell the federal agents it was all a massive misunderstanding, a simple marital dispute that got completely out of hand. He frantically tried to deploy the exact same manipulative tactics he had used to control her for years, crying that he only committed these terrible financial crimes because of the crushing, overwhelming pressure of the startup world. He sobbed uncontrollably, claiming that the immense stress of trying to build an empire for their future had simply driven him to make a few bad choices. Kendra did not even blink. She stared down at him with an expression of absolute freezing apathy, completely immune to the toxic poison he was spewing. Seeing his wife completely unmoved by his lies, Brad desperately shifted his frantic gaze to me. He actually had the sheer brazen audacity to look at me and call me Dad. He begged me to use my immense newly revealed wealth to pay his federal bail, promising wildly that he would pay me back every single cent with heavy interest. I looked down at him, my posture perfectly straight, my face completely devoid of any human sympathy. I stared at him with the cold, detached eyes of a reigning king watching a filthy, insignificant beggar grovel in the mud. I told him that men who secretly poison their wives and steal from the dead do not get second chances or mercy. I told him that his pathetic excuses were nothing but the cowardly whining of a weak, arrogant man who finally met his match. I signaled the federal agents with a brief dismissive wave of my hand indicating I was completely finished looking at the trash staining my stage. Seeing their golden child officially bound in heavy steel handcuffs finally snapped Brad's parents out of their paralyzed state of shock. Driven by the blinding, arrogant entitlement that had dictated their entire privileged lives, they rushed aggressively toward the stage steps. Brad's father violently shouted at the federal agents demanding they release his son immediately. He wildly claimed that he personally knew the mayor, that he played golf with the state governor, and that he would personally ensure every single officer in the room lost their badge for this profound, unforgivable insult to his family name. His mother shrieked hysterically, attempting to physically grab the arm of the police chief to pull him away from her weeping son. The federal agents did not tolerate the aggressive interference for a single microsecond. Two heavily armored officers swiftly stepped forward, planting their hands firmly against the chests of Brad's parents and shoving them backward with aggressive, uncompromising force. The lead federal agent pointed a stern, threatening finger directly at Brad's father, warning him in a lethal, no-nonsense tone that if he took one more step toward the active suspect, he would be immediately thrown to the concrete floor and charged with felony obstruction of justice. The terrifying threat of actual physical force and jail time instantly silenced the arrogant parents. They stumbled backward, wrapping their arms around each other in sheer, unadulterated terror, finally realizing that their fake social status and privilege meant absolutely nothing to the federal government. The agents violently yanked Brad back to his feet. They did not allow him a moment to fix his ruined velvet tuxedo or wipe the disgusting mix of snot and tears from his face. They dragged him roughly across the wooden stage and down the long center aisle of the grand ballroom. The elite media and tech journalists Brad had personally invited to document his glorious triumph now eagerly turned their high-definition cameras on his spectacular, undeniable downfall. A blinding, relentless storm of bright white camera flashes erupted continuously as he was paraded through the crowd. The wealthy investors parted ways, watching in silent, utter disgust as the sobbing, ruined CEO was forcefully hauled out the heavy glass doors, dragged down the entrance steps, and shoved aggressively into the back of a waiting, heavily armored police transport vehicle under the flashing red and blue lights. The heavy steel doors of the police cruiser slammed shut with a definitive ringing thud, sealing Bradley Sutton inside his new, inescapable reality. The piercing sirens roared back to life, fading slowly into the cool night air as the massive armed convoy transported him straight to a federal holding cell. Back inside the grand, glittering ballroom, the blinding camera flashes finally ceased, leaving the remaining crowd in a state of absolute breathless shock. The primary operation to destroy Brad was flawlessly executed and completely finished. However, the devastating life-altering consequences for the enablers who had enthusiastically participated in his cruelty were far from over. I turned my attention away from the exit doors and looked down at Brad's parents, who were still trembling near the front row, utterly devastated by the total loss of their son and their fabricated social standing. I gave a slow, deliberate nod to my attorney. Rick stepped forward to the very edge of the stage, his predatory shark-like smile returning in full force. He opened his pristine leather briefcase one final time and pulled out a thick, heavily notarized legal document bearing the official, undeniable seal of the state court. He looked directly at Brad's sobbing mother and his pale, defeated father, completely ready to deliver the final crushing blow. He announced that the financial reckoning was not quite finished, holding the heavy paper high in the air for them to see. Rick's voice sliced through the heavy silence of the ballroom with brutal, unyielding clarity. He did not address the whispering crowd of elite investors. His sharp, predatory gaze was locked entirely on Brad's weeping mother and his pale, shaking father. Rick held the heavy, notarized document high under the stage lights and formally announced that it was an immediate, non-negotiable writ of foreclosure and eviction. The color completely vanished from the older couple's faces as Rick detailed the sickening depth of their son's betrayal. Brad had not just mortgaged his own miserable life to secure his illegal loans from the violent gambling syndicate. In his blind, desperate greed, he had secretly forged the signatures of his own parents, pledging the original deed to their sprawling ancestral estate as collateral for the criminal underworld. Because the federal government had just officially seized Brad's entire corporate network and Apex Holdings had frozen his liquidity, the massive high-interest syndicate debt had instantly defaulted. The creditors had immediately executed their legal right to seize the collateral. Rick leaned forward, a ruthless smile playing on his lips, and informed the parents that the local sheriff's department, accompanied by a team of aggressive foreclosure agents, was already standing on their pristine front lawn. They had successfully changed the locks on the heavy oak doors exactly 10 minutes ago. Their bank accounts were completely drained by the automatic seizure clauses, and their credit was instantly destroyed. They had absolutely 0 hours to pack, zero legal recourse to fight the injunction, and absolutely nowhere to run. The luxurious, privileged lifestyle they had continuously weaponized to demean others was completely annihilated in the blink of an eye. The immediate aftermath of the gala was a masterful display of poetic justice. Driven out of the luxury hotel by the sheer, unbearable weight of their public humiliation, Brad's parents scrambled into a cheap, lingering city cab because their own luxury vehicles had already been impounded. When they finally arrived at their gated community, the devastating reality of Rick's announcement crashed down upon them. A line of stark yellow police tape surrounded the perimeter of their massive home. 2 local sheriff deputies stood firmly on the front porch, refusing them entry into the house they had owned for decades. The deputies handed the sobbing couple 2 flimsy black plastic garbage bags containing a few random items of cheap basic clothing the foreclosure agents had hastily tossed together. The biting, freezing autumn wind whipped aggressively down the quiet suburban street, biting through their thin, expensive evening wear. I watched this entire miserable scene unfold live through the encrypted security feed Dexter had intercepted from their neighborhood cameras. The profound irony of the situation was absolute perfection. Just hours earlier in the catering kitchen of their son's home, this arrogant man had leaned over my table reeking of expensive bourbon and gleefully mocked my dark skin and my supposedly impoverished existence. He had sneered at my humble background and boasted that people like me were destined to suffer in the slums while his elite bloodline reigned supreme. Now the wealthy, arrogant titan of industry was standing on a freezing concrete sidewalk in the dead of night, clutching a garbage bag full of wrinkled clothes. His elitist wife, who had looked at my brilliant daughter with nothing but pure, unadulterated contempt, was now sitting on the cold, hard curb, weeping hysterically into her hands. They were completely homeless, entirely destitute, and utterly abandoned by the high society friends they had spent their entire lives trying to impress. The people who had arrogantly mocked my existence in the slums were now left shivering in the cold, experiencing the exact level of sheer, agonizing desperation they had so casually wished upon me. While Brad's parents were facing their freezing exile, Vanessa's desperate attempt to escape the consequences of her greed was coming to a rapid, crushing halt. She had sprinted out of the hotel ballroom, abandoning the diamond ring and her ruined lover, foolishly believing she could simply melt back into the city and find another wealthy target to manipulate. But federal agents are not easily evaded, and Dexter's digital tracking was flawless. Before Vanessa could even reach the departure terminal of the international airport the next morning, a team of federal agents intercepted her. She was immediately detained and dragged into a harsh, brightly lit interrogation room. The authorities did not care about her tears or her desperate claims of ignorance. She was formally investigated for the illegal receipt and consumption of stolen funds. The federal prosecutors laid out the undeniable evidence proving that the lavish mansion, the designer wardrobes, and the luxury vehicles she enjoyed were all purchased using the stolen trust fund money Brad had illegally drained from Kendra's inheritance. Because the funds were directly tied to massive wire fraud and grand larceny, the federal government initiated immediate asset forfeiture. Every single one of Vanessa's personal bank accounts, including her hidden emergency funds, was permanently frozen. The authorities seized her expensive jewelry, auctioned off her designer bags, and completely stripped her of every physical asset she had accumulated over the past 2 years. She was left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back and a towering stack of legal fees she could never hope to pay. Facing the terrifying prospect of hard time in a federal penitentiary, Vanessa desperately accepted a harsh plea deal. She was handed a severe suspended prison sentence, completely destroying her pristine record and placing her under strict, suffocating federal probation for the next decade. The glamorous, untouchable mistress was reduced to a convicted felon, legally barred from leaving the state and forced to work menial minimum wage jobs just to survive the crushing weight of her court-ordered restitution. Over the next several weeks, the chaotic ashes of Brad's fabricated empire finally settled into cold, hard reality. Guided by Rick's ruthless and precise legal maneuvering, the mountain of irrefutable federal evidence was weaponized to completely obliterate the remnants of Kendra's marriage. The divorce proceedings were expedited with surgical efficiency. Kendra was officially granted an absolute unilateral dissolution of the marriage. The state court reviewed the extensive proof of Brad's financial manipulation, the forged signatures, and the horrific medical abuse. The judge fully and completely exonerated my daughter from every single penny of the massive, fraudulent business loans Brad had illegally taken out in her name. The entire suffocating financial burden was placed squarely and permanently on his shoulders. Kendra stepped out of the courthouse doors and took a deep, grounding breath of the crisp morning air. She was totally free, legally untethered from the monster who had tried to destroy her mind and steal her future. She did not bear a single cent of his debt, and she retained full, uncompromised ownership of her veterinary clinic. She stood tall, a triumphant survivor ready to reclaim her life. Exactly 2 months later, the ultimate day of reckoning arrived. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung wide open and the gallery quickly filled to capacity. The final criminal trial of Bradley Sutton was about to begin. 2 months later, the heavy mahogany doors of the federal courthouse swung shut, sealing the fate of the man who had tried to destroy my family. The gallery was packed, but a heavy, suffocating silence hung in the air as we waited for the judge to deliver the final blow. I sat in the front row next to Kendra. When the side door opened and the bailiffs led Bradley Sutton into the room, a collective murmur rippled through the spectators. Brad was completely unrecognizable. The arrogant, imposing tech CEO who used to strut through 5-star hotels in custom velvet suits was entirely gone. He looked as though he had aged 10 years in just 60 days. His face was gaunt and hollow, his skin a sickly pale gray. His hair, once perfectly styled, was thinning and unkempt. He was drowning in a harsh, oversized orange prison jumpsuit that hung loosely off his diminishing frame. The heavy steel chains around his wrists and ankles clinked loudly with every defeated step he took toward the defense table. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, his posture completely broken under the crushing weight of his inevitable ruin. The federal judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at Brad with absolute contempt. He did not mince words. He detailed the sheer malice of Brad's financial crimes, the profound domestic abuse, and the gross manipulation of the banking system. The judge raised his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down with a thunderous crack that echoed off the high ceiling. He sentenced Bradley Sutton to 15 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. There would be no early release. There would be no leniency. There would be absolutely no leniency. There would be absolutely no possibility of parole. Brad's knees buckled and he collapsed heavily into his wooden chair, burying his face in his chained hands as he sobbed uncontrollably. As the court adjourned, the heavily armed federal bailiff stepped forward and hauled Brad up by his arms to transport him to the holding cells. As they dragged him down the center aisle, he frantically twisted his neck, his red, swollen eyes desperately searching the gallery until they landed on Kendra. Tears streamed down his hollow cheeks as he loudly begged her for just one final look. He pleaded for a single ounce of pity, sobbing her name and begging her to remember the good times they had shared. Kendra did not even flinch. She stood up from the wooden bench, smoothing the fabric of her elegant tailored suit. Her posture was flawless, her spine perfectly straight. She did not turn her head. She did not offer him a single syllable of comfort or closure. She simply kept her gaze fixed firmly ahead, her face radiating absolute, untouchable power. She walked right past the weeping, broken man as if he were nothing more than a ghost, leaving him to be dragged away into the darkness of the federal prison system forever. With the monster finally locked away, it was time to actively rebuild what he had tried to destroy. I immediately deployed a massive wave of capital from Apex Holdings. I did not just clear the fraudulent debt attached to Kendra's veterinary clinic. I forcefully bought the entire commercial building where her practice was located, purchasing the surrounding lots and securing total ownership of the block. I brought in elite contractors and state-of-the-art medical equipment. Over the next few weeks, I transformed her modest clinic into a sprawling multi-million-dollar medical facility. It officially became the largest, most advanced veterinary hospital in the entire state. Kendra was no longer just a struggling veterinarian trying to keep the lights on under the crushing weight of a toxic marriage. She was officially named the chief executive director of a premier medical institution, commanding a massive staff and operating with total, uncompromised financial freedom. She stepped into her new corner office, looking out over the facility we built together, her brilliant mind finally allowed to flourish without restraint. I watched her run her hands over her new mahogany desk, a genuine radiant smile illuminating her face. The woman who had been systematically poisoned and manipulated had completely reclaimed her rightful place in the world. She was a titan in her own right, fiercely independent and backed by an empire that would protect her for the rest of her life. With our enemies entirely vanquished and our financial legacy firmly secured, I officially closed the door on my old life. I packed up the few meaningful possessions I kept in that modest, run-down suburban house and moved permanently into the downtown penthouse with my daughter. The transition was a profound, deeply healing experience for both of us. The massive glass-walled apartment was no longer just a secret fortress used for executing corporate revenge. It transformed into a sanctuary of genuine warmth filled with the bright, unmistakable sound of my daughter's laughter. The heavy, suffocating anxiety that had plagued our lives for years evaporated completely, replaced by an atmosphere of absolute peace and unconditional security. We spent our evenings cooking elaborate meals together in the massive chef's kitchen, sharing stories and planning our future without the looming shadow of a manipulative predator tracking our every move. Kendra's physical health bounded back with incredible speed. Free from the toxic synthetic hormones and the psychological torture, her natural energy returned, her eyes bright and focused. We no longer had to hide our success or shrink ourselves down to make arrogant, bigoted people feel comfortable. We hosted charity dinners, funded community outreach programs, and openly enjoyed the staggering wealth my late wife and I had built from the ground up. The toxic presence of Brad, his racist parents, and his greedy mistress was completely eradicated from our universe. They were nothing more than a cautionary tale, a dark chapter that had forcefully taught us the true value of loyalty and the immense power of our own resilience. We built a new existence entirely free of liars, leeches, and opportunists. In this new life, there was no room for manipulation or deceit. There was only absolute, unwavering respect and the profound, unbreakable love between a father and his daughter. We had fought a brutal, silent war against a family of monsters, and we had emerged completely victorious, owning the very city that had once tried to cast us out. Every morning I watched Kendra leave for her hospital, exuding the kind of fierce, confident grace that made me incredibly proud to be her father. I spent my days managing our vast philanthropic trusts, ensuring that the wealth we protected would continue to empower those who truly needed it. Our home was a fortress of light and truth, standing tall above the noise of the world below. Late one evening, long after the city had quieted down, I stepped out onto the sprawling glass balcony of the penthouse. The crisp night wind brushed against my face as I stood near the edge, looking down at the glittering, endless sea of city lights stretching out for miles beneath me. The world below looked peaceful, completely unaware of the massive destructive storms that had recently raged through its financial arteries. I reached deep into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small, wrinkled piece of paper. It was the exact same crumpled, grease-stained $100 bill that Brad had arrogantly thrown into my dinner plate at the restaurant all those months ago. I smoothed the edges of the bill between my fingers, staring at it for a long moment. I pulled a sleek silver lighter from my other pocket. I flipped the metal lid open, ignited the bright, steady flame, and held it directly to the corner of the currency. The fire caught instantly. I watched the paper blacken and curl, the flame slowly consuming the face of the bill until the fire licked dangerously close to my fingertips. I opened my hand and let the burning embers drop, watching the ashes scatter and disappear completely into the cold night wind. I looked back out over my city, my posture straight and unyielding. Respect cannot be bought with money, but money is the perfect tool to teach the arrogant exactly where they stand. Looking back at this entire ordeal, I realized another crucial truth about human nature. Predators like Brad thrive on the illusion of our weakness. They mistake silence for compliance and patience for submission. But true strength does not need to scream to be heard. It waits, it watches, and it gathers its forces in the shadows. By refusing to react emotionally to his petty provocations, I allowed him to become his own worst enemy. The greatest weapon you can wield against a narcissist is letting them believe they are winning right up until the floor collapses beneath them. Your dignity is not defined by how loudly you fight back, but by how decisively you end the war. Tell me in the comments if you have ever had to outsmart a manipulator in your own life, and do not forget to subscribe for more stories of justice.